Hey, what's up? Welcome to Crime Dive, the penultimate episode of 2022. My name is Crystal Sky, and if you're anything like me, you find yourself drawn to true crime cases. So yeah, that's what I talk about. If you like true crime, and you also want to feel better about your makeup skills, you should totally, if you want, like, subscribe, and let's hang out together every Tuesday, where I will take a deep dive look into a true crime case while slapping on the old clown paint. Merry Christmas and happy holidays. Just wanted to take the time to say that to y'all since, by the time we meet again next week, Christmas will already have passed. I hope whatever you do this holiday season, whatever holiday you celebrate, whatever you choose to do, I hope it is just wonderful and awesome. I hope you just have a wonderful, safe holiday, whether it's with family, friends, your pets, maybe on your own. Whatever it is, I hope you just have a wonderful, safe time. And yeah, thank you so much for just hanging out with me all year. I can't believe it's gonna be almost a year since I've started this silly little channel, so thank you so much. Yeah, like I said, man, there's just this and next week's episode, and that's it for 2022. Can you believe it? I'm sorry, man. It really is true. The older you get, the faster time really does fly. I cannot believe we're already at the end of 2022. All right, well, enough chit-chat. Let's get to why we're all here. It is the conclusion of the deep dive look that we were taking into the Tom Capano case. Welcome to part 3, where we will conclude the case. We'll pick up where we left off last week with the investigation of the disappearance of Annie just beginning. It was just the beginnings. And remember, we left off with Detective Donovan, Lieutenant Daniels, Sergeant Montag, and Donovan's supervisor, Sergeant Elmer Harris, all leaving in the middle of the night to go speak with Tom Capano. If you remember, Annie's family found some pretty intimate letters from Tom. We read some of them. So they knew that, they were going to have to speak with him. They also had that email where he said that they were going to go eat dinner together Thursday night, and that is the last time anyone saw Annie. If you will remember, Annie's last sighting was Thursday evening, June 27th, 1996, when she was having dinner with Tom in Philadelphia. So it is now in the wee early morning hours of Monday, July 1st, 1996, around 3:30 in the morning, that all of the policemen head to Tom Capano's house to speak with him about Annie, see what he knew and whatnot. And we'll just pick up from there. So the policemen get to Tom's home, right? So they knock on the door, and they clearly woke Tom up. He sleepily answered the door, and his demeanor was described as not really being surprised and all that shocked that they were at his door. Remember, he had spoken with Kim, so he did know Annie was missing. Tom told the men that he last saw Annie, quote, either Wednesday, maybe Thursday night. We had dinner at a restaurant in Philadelphia. As we know, it was the Panorama. And, he was asked, of course, more questions to elaborate a bit further about that evening with Annie, right? And as he spoke, he's like, oh, yeah, you know what? It's for sure Thursday night. For sure Thursday night. And he said he picked Annie up from her apartment around 6:30 that evening. He described what she had been wearing. It was that flower dress that Kathleen and the others found in Annie's apartment. He said they had driven to Philadelphia, had a nice meal, and then the two drove back to Wilmington. He said they drove back to his house, but stopped there only briefly. Quote, I went inside to get some things for her. Food, rice, bananas, spinach, soup, and I had a gift for her. As we know, it's that pantsuit. I can't remember now if I had left it in the house or if it was in my car. He said that they then drove back to Annie's place, but he recalled that as they were getting out, to, walk towards her apartment, he turned around because he had forgotten something in the car while Annie went up to her apartment alone. Now, Tom said that while he was gone down in the car and Annie walked up to her apartment, she opened his gift. Quote, but I don't think she took it completely out of the box. He remembered bringing the food into the apartment for her. He put it on the counter, and he claimed that he looked at her AC on her request. It was running fine. He used the restroom, and then he left. On the way back home, he said he stopped at a gas station for some cigarettes. And he said that was the last night and the last time he had seen or spoken with Annie. Now, when they asked Tom, do you have any idea where she might be? Tom just smiled and said, quote, Anne-Marie is very airheaded, unpredictable. I think she's probably just run off someplace, and she'll be back to work on Monday. She'll come walking in right on time. Interesting characterization of Annie by Tom, right? Tom theorized that she'd probably just taken off to the beach. Now, as the the police talked to Tom more and more, it was, obvious that he did know Annie quite well. He knew of Annie's plans to take Friday off from work, that she didn't want to attend the legislative session going on in Dover. He told them about the, quote, big fight that she had with her sister Kathleen. And Tom said that all of these factors, coupled with, Annie's airheadedness, just resulted in the fact that Annie had taken off somewhere for the weekend, And when asked about the nature of his relationship with Annie, apparently Tom wasted no time in telling authorities that, yeah, we had a sexual relationship. But he said that had happened long ago, and now they were just really good friends. Quote, we haven't done anything sexual for the past 6 months. She has psychological problems. She's been on medications, just having a hard time dealing with it all. I've spent a lot of time helping her with her psychological problems. I mean, are you really surprised? I'm not surprised at Tom's behavior at this point. We've done a pretty thorough look into who this guy is in his life. It's just... It's just one of the, I just can't believe it. I can't believe it. You know what I mean? It's just wow, dude. Wow. Now, when asked if they thought that Annie perhaps may be suicidal, Tom sighed and said, yes, it is possible. And he said that Annie had talked about committing suicide with her medications in the past. He also repeated that lie and told them that he was the one who had found Dr. Sullivan for Annie. Remember, that was her new therapist who specialized in eating disorders and was really helping Annie. He also said that he personally knew Dr. Sullivan. Now, I'm not sure, dude, okay, what is it with these guys? I get that he's narcissists, but my God, dude, do you not think they're gonna go to Dr. Sullivan and be like, hey, he said that he found you for Annie, that he personally knows you? What is it? What is it, guys? Can someone explain that to me? They're not gonna go ask Dr. Sullivan how she came to be in Annie's life and if she knows Tom. Now, Detective Donovan made a comment about the many gifts that it seemed that Tom gave to Annie based on all the letters they found, And Tom, acknowledged, yeah, he had given Annie lots of gifts. He gives lots of people lots of gifts because he's very generous. Lieutenant Daniels, I guess, then bluntly asked Tom, quote, Mr. Capano, can you tell us whether or not Anne-Marie is in this house at the moment? Tom said no. Tom ended up talking with the men for about a half hour, and Anne Rule described it in her book that the entire questioning was in a, quote, polite, if not edgy tone, Oh, and by the way, as a reminder, I did read Anne Rule's book and Never Let Her Go to get the bulk information for this case. Highly recommend. It's a really good book. Now, when the men then asked Tom if they could search his house, Tom said no, they couldn't. And it was because at that moment, remember, it was 4 a.m. at this point, he claimed anyway, that his daughters were asleep upstairs. And he didn't want the men to spook them or wake them up. And the investigators, of course, understood this, and they said, no worries. We'll be back later on today to talk with you some more, see what else he can offer. Now, it was clear from this little interview with Tom that he was being cooperative with investigators, but it was obviously up to a point, which is probably why Anne Rule described it that way, like a polite, if not edgy type of fashion, Definitely probably some tension there, right? So when investigators left, they didn't really have much of an opinion one way or the other. They didn't really know Annie, they just knew of what people were telling them. They were, of course, aware of who Tom Capano was. And he did admit, they had an affair, but, they didn't have, any probable cause or any type of evidence to point them in any direction, let alone Tom's direction. So they weren't quite sure, what to make of the case just yet. Especially when Tom was describing Annie in such a sort of disparaging way, calling her an airhead and suicidal, when that was not, of course, what her family and friends and her boyfriend, Michael Scanlon, told investigators of her character and state of mind, right? So hours later that same morning around 8 a.m., Tom called up Kim. And he just lamented onto her about how the investigators had woken up in the middle of the night and interrogated him. He said he had been especially drowsy because he had taken a bunch of Excedrin PM just a couple of hours earlier. And he said due to that, he had overshared with investigators and now he was worried. He told her that he remembered now that it was Jackie who Annie was supposed to go to the beach with, not Kim. He had just gotten them mixed up. For 38 minutes, Tom talked to Kim on the phone, just giving reassurances of, oh, Annie just took off. It's fine. She'll be back to work on Monday. Things have been tough and she'll be back. By the way, I think I misspoke earlier when I opened the video. I said it was the early morning hours of Monday, July 1st. No. It was the early morning hours of Sunday, June 30th, 1996, when investigators went to Tom's. My bad. Sometimes I just get the dates a little mixed up. So sorry. So a couple hours after this, after Tom has called Kim, investigators stopped by Tom's house once again. But surprise, surprise, you're not going to be shocked to learn Tom wasn't there. He didn't answer their knocks and he was nowhere to be found. Now, because investigators had told Tom, like, hey, we'll be back later on in the morning to talk with you some more, and Tom said, yeah, cool, that's fine, they thought maybe Tom was trying to avoid them. So they started scouring Wilmington and the greater area around it, looking for Tom. Finally, after driving by Kay's home for like the 6th or 7th time, investigators spotted Tom walking out of the garage. But when they approached Tom this time, he was not nearly as forthright as he had been earlier. He was clearly agitated. He told them that he was upset with himself for oversharing about Annie when they had woken him up that morning. He had taken too many Excedrin PMs, and that's why he was a little more loose with his lips than he should have been. And it is said that he reluctantly let investigators do a walkthrough of his home, but he wouldn't let them do like a search of drawers or anything like that. They could just do like a cursory walk through the house. They, of course, didn't find Annie, didn't find any trace that she had ever been there, and Tom just once again reassured everyone there that, hey, she's gonna be back in tomorrow, you'll see. She was just, slacking off. It was fine. Everything was fine. Everyone was overreacting. But it is said Detective Donovan, remember Detective Bob Donovan? He was a veteran cop, but this was like his first year as a detective. Just had that gut feeling, you've heard that a couple of times, especially in true crime cases, right? Where investigators say that they develop like a gut feeling about cases when they see enough of it. And yeah, unfortunately, Detective Donovan's gut told him that this wasn't going to have a happy ending. Annie was not going to come into work on Monday. Now, later that same evening, Tom called Kim again to ask if he could call her later. He told her that he was currently at Kay's house and he wanted to call her back later that evening. And this was after quickly getting off the phone after he had called Kim. Apparently his brother, Louis Jr., had just come in, so he quickly got off the phone with Kim and said that he would call her later, but he never did. So meanwhile, that same morning, but hours earlier, so like around the time that Tom is calling Kim around 8 a.m. or so, Kathleen went back to her sister's apartment along with Michael. Now, as we know, the Fahey siblings had a bunch of tragedy in their lives, and as such, it caused them to have a very close, tight bond. They kept a lot of tabs on each other. And because they were so close, they had decided that at least one of them would be in Annie's apartment at all times, just in case anything came in, like mail, a phone call, someone stopping by, anything that would lead to Annie's return. Or if, maybe even Annie herself came home, they wanted someone there to welcome her. And eventually, Annie's brother Mark would end up like moving into the apartment like semi-permanently. Now, neither Kathleen or Michael had slept at all since they had first reported Annie missing. And Kathleen was really agonizing and stressing about telling Michael about Tom. She knew that the information about the letters was going to come out. He was going to be told one way or the other. And she just figured, it should come from her rather than, him find out by someone else, by the media, by the cops or something. So when she met Michael at Annie's apartment, she told him like, hey, so it looks like at some point in time, Annie and Tom Capano had a relationship, and she, told him about the whole thing. But it is said this did not dissuade Michael, and he continued aiding in the search for Annie. He just, he really cared for her, and I don't think he really cared about some, tryst she may or may have had with someone else. That was the impression that I got. So by Monday morning, when Annie didn't walk into work at 7, 8, or 9 a.m., her face covered the front page of the Wilmington News Journal, which was a newspaper, the local newspaper, of course, and I actually came across quite a few articles about the case. Now, the reason they were able to execute the story rather quickly is, remember, Annie worked in the governor's office, which meant that, her family was privy to a lot more, like, privilege and information than, other families that would be in this situation. They spoke with Governor Carper's spokeswoman, who was able to, help them navigate the ins and out of, like, media and how to get their, story the most traction, like that kind of stuff. And due to Annie's position in the governor's office, coupled with like her beauty, her story spread pretty wide amongst the region and pretty quickly. Her brothers and sisters ended up using her apartment as sort of like a headquarters, and they set to work park, trying to find their sister. They went through her address book and divided up pages and went, number by number, address by address, and anyone that she had listed in there to see if they had heard anything from her. They even called her host family that she had stayed with when she went to Spain long ago, see if maybe, they had heard from her. They hadn't. And they even tried to come up with a list of friends and acquaintances that hadn't been listed in Annie's address book. That was one of the problems, is she was so sociable and so outgoing. She had so many, not just close friends, but, casual friends, acquaintances, co-workers. She knew so many people. The police had also asked Kathleen to take an inventory of her sister's apartment and see if there was anything missing. Maybe that could point them in the direction of where she could possibly be, or at least what happened to her. Turns out there were some things missing. There were Annie's keys, we talked about that, her Walkman, and a blue topaz ring that I guess she habitually wore were all missing. And of course, as most, loved ones do, everyone tried to, keep their hopes up and, tried to rationalize, where she could be, why this was happening. But as the days passed, of course, that dreadful thought starts entering your mind, right? Could she be dead? So this case was especially tough for law enforcement, right? Because they had absolutely, no clue where to start with this case, right? They had nothing. So at first, they were theorizing that Annie had, come home to her apartment. She had made it to her apartment, and she had left in a vehicle of some sort. But again, that was just a theory. They didn't even know when she disappeared and had absolutely no idea where to even start with this case. Before they could verify Tom's story, of course, because they were going to have to verify it, they were able to verify that for sure, they knew for sure the last person to see Annie on Thursday was someone she worked with, Diane Hastings. She was the office manager and had ridden the elevator down with Annie on Thursday afternoon when they were leaving for work. And Diane told them how excited Annie was to have a Friday off, how she was really looking forward to just, having a me day. She told Diane she was going to get a mani-pedi at the Michael Christopher Design Salon. Then she was going to go to the park and just relax on a bench and read a book. Enjoy that gorgeous summer weather, So when Diane told them that, they theorized okay, well, maybe she made it to the park. Could someone have nabbed her there? Maybe that's where she disappeared from. But a call to the salon informed them that Annie had not shown up for her appointment that Friday, and she did not call to cancel. So chances are Annie had not even made it to the park. Coupled with the fact that her car was still parked in front of her apartment, pretty easy to deduce that, all right, she never made it to the salon. Chances are she did not make it to the park. Dr. Sullivan was interviewed again, and this time she had remembered something about a session that she had with Annie, and she told investigators that she feared Annie may have possibly been abducted. So she recalled one session that she had with Annie, and Annie had made a pretty strange comment that now in hindsight she wished she would have pursued further. So Dr. Sullivan said, quote, "She came into the office and mentioned that a friend said that somebody could kidnap her. I said, well, talk to me more about this. And she said, oh, I don't know. Somebody could just take me away or something." Now, when Dr. Sullivan asked her, well, who on earth would do this? Annie replied, quote, "Probably a third party." And that's when Dr. Sullivan replied, quote, "What do you mean? That somebody would hire a third party?" Annie said, yes, that is exactly what she meant. And who would do such a thing? Of course, Dr. Sullivan had asked her, who on earth would do this? Annie had replied, quote, "Tom Capano." And remember, Dr. Sullivan was aware of the stalking behavior of Tom. Remember, Annie had grown close to Dr. Sullivan, and she had confided in her, probably about the affair, certainly about Tom's stalking, obsessive behavior. And Dr. Sullivan also told police that, the last session that Annie had and the last few sessions prior to that, they were working on her getting Tom completely out of her life. Remember, that was a big chunk of last week's video, was going over how Annie was trying to detach from Tom, but he was just not letting go. And Dr. Sullivan told investigators that she was trying to nudge Annie to report Tom to somebody, the Attorney General, the cops, somebody. But Annie would always decline, saying she felt embarrassed, especially because of the fact that, she worked in the governor's office. She feared that the story would leak and it would just be all kinds of drama and it would be out there in the public, and she just did not want that. But she did tell Dr. Sullivan at one point, I guess she had an acquaintance who worked at the Attorney General's office, and she had called them up on the pretense of it being for a friend and asking some advice on hey, what could one do if they thought they were being stalked or harassed by someone? And I guess she had taken down that information. And so investigators at this point point, they're like, huh, it's weird. Once again, Tom Capano's name's coming up in this investigation. And it is said by that Sunday afternoon, Tom had made himself completely unavailable to investigators. When they had done that cursory walkthrough of his home, that was the last time Tom made himself available to them. On Monday, July 1st, Lieutenant Daniels drove to the Panorama restaurant in Philadelphia. He, of course, needed to verify Tom's story, right? So he went to the Panorama to see if he could talk to the waitress who had served the couple and check Tom's story, make sure he had paid, all that stuff. So, of course, looking through Tom's credit card and receipt transaction, that was easy enough to verify that, like, okay, he actually was here, he used his credit card, and, he dined here. They found the waitress who had served Tom. It was a woman named Jacqueline Danzig. Now, Jacqueline, turns out, had a pretty excellent memory, and she always kind of did this thing with customers where she always kind of tried to, figure out, okay, what's the situation here? Is this, a married couple? Oh, is this person, fighting with the person they're dining with? She kind of did that. And because she kind of had this little, quirk that she liked to do, she certainly remembered Tom and his dinner date. They stood out to her. And it was mainly because she couldn't really get a read on them. Jacqueline said, quote, "They were unusually dressed for the atmosphere. And this couple, especially the female, she was wearing a flower-printed dress. Most of our clientele are from the main line, very fashionably dressed, bedazzled and whatnot. Most women who come in wear black, or something a little more jet-setty looking." And she reiterated to Lieutenant Daniels how, she just couldn't get a read on this couple. She said they didn't seem like they were, dating. They didn't seem like they were married. And it was pretty obvious that they weren't there on, a business meeting either. It was definitely, personal. She noticed that the man was considerably older, but not, noticeably old enough to be the woman's, father or something. But what really stuck out to Jacqueline, and it was probably one of the reasons it was hard for her to get a gauge on them, was the fact the couple did not interact with each other at all. Jacqueline said, quote, "They didn't speak to each other at all. This gentleman, ordered everything for the woman without consulting her. They started off with cocktails. They had a 3-course meal. I sold the special to the woman. She had swordfish. The gentleman had veal or chicken." Now, Jacqueline was quite sure they weren't having an active argument, probably because they weren't really talking, but it did seem like there was some kind of tension there. It almost seemed like maybe they were, exasperated with one another, they were had come to some sort of an impasse or something. That was the vibe that Jacqueline was getting. Now, other than not speaking to each other, Jacqueline noticed that the woman was, especially quiet, more quiet than Tom. She was, quote, "somber. She looked haggard and gaunt. Her hair was unkempt. She was very thin. They barely touched their meals." And Jacqueline said when she was wrapping up, the woman's meal in a to-go box, she noticed that she hadn't really touched her swordfish. And, she asked her, could I get you something else? But the woman just, shook her head. Now, to Jacqueline, it seemed to her that the woman was just awfully depressed. She just seemed so sad and just bumming hard at being there. Jacqueline went over the receipt with Lieutenant Daniels. Tom had started a tab at 7:10 p.m. and had closed out at 9:12 p.m. Jacqueline said she also remembered that it was odd when they were checking out. So even though it was Tom's card that had run, it was, Tom paying, she said it was weird because when she dropped the bill off, Tom slid it to his dinner date, and she was the one who filled out the generous tip and signed the receipt. And it was signed Tom J. Capano. And yeah, Jacqueline said it was really easy to remember this couple just because they were just so odd. She couldn't make heads or tails of it. The woman just seemed so forlorn and depressed, just super sad. Well, yeah, the man just kind of came off as very domineering, very bossy. She identified a photo of Anne that Lieutenant Daniels showed her, and it was verified that was Annie who Tom had dined with. Lieutenant Daniels did not have a photo of Tom to show Jacqueline, but I'm sure having his credit card was probably verification enough. And Jacqueline's eyewitness testimony ended up being crucial because, it verified that Tom was indeed the last one to be seen with Annie before she disappeared. And by July 2nd, the press was reporting that Annie had last been seen dining at a Philadelphia restaurant with a, quote, prominent Wilmington attorney. Now, Debbie had seen the headline with Annie's picture and had seen the front page story, but she hadn't really paid too much attention to it. True crime wasn't really her thing, and she hadn't really thought too much about it. That is, until Tom called Debbie up and informed her that he was indeed the prominent Wilmington attorney last seen dining with Annie. He also informed Debbie that he was a suspect in Annie's disappearance. He told her he had hired Charlie Oberly, who was a former attorney general for Delaware, on top of being a good friend, to represent him. And he was telling Debbie that she had to talk to his lawyer. Now, Debbie was stunned at this news. What was Tom doing having dinner with another woman and without telling her? Like, why was he the last one to see her alive? And just, yeah, Debbie just kind of felt everything collapsing around her. She trusted Tom with everything that she had. And after over a decade of their affair, she never for once thought that Tom would have other women. So Debbie met with Oberly, who basically just kind of wanted a timetable of Debbie of like when she had spoken with Tom and whatnot. And yeah, Debbie didn't really get to find out too much more about what was going on. She told Oberly that Tom told her that he had a business meeting in Philadelphia that Thursday evening, and her and Tom had spoken on the phone a few times later that evening after 10 p.m. She saw Tom the next morning, Friday, spoken with him throughout the day, and he ended up spending Friday night with her. Now, after she spoke with Oberly, Tom, who at this point had run away to his mom's house in Stone Harbor, his brother Jerry also had a home there, Tom called up Debbie and explained who Annie was. He admitted that he did have a long-term affair with Annie, and when Debbie asked, he also admitted that at one point he did love her. Now, Debbie was absolutely speechless and heartbroken at this. I mean, after all, whenever she had gone out with other men, remember, was at Tom's insistence, she had always told him. But now he was like, confessing to this like love affair with like a 30-year-old on top of that. Even as he was telling Debbie that he loved her, he told Debbie, quote, "She had so many problems. I was so good to her. I was helpful and I was interested. But then I couldn't get rid of her. He couldn't get rid of her. She was so mentally ill, Debbie. She attached herself to me, and I knew I had to unload her." And yeah, Debbie was just stunned. And Tom, get this, Tom couldn't understand why Debbie was being so emotional. I mean, after all, he didn't love Annie anymore, so there was no reason for her to be upset. That was Tom's reasoning. He didn't understand why Debbie was so emotional. Oh no, dude, I'm not in love with her anymore though, so there's no reason to be upset. He apologized to Debbie for having to tell her about Annie, but he knew the story was going to hit the papers, and he figured it was better that, she hear this all from him rather than the press. Debbie then asked Tom if there had been other women, and Tom admitted to the affair that he was having with Susan, remember Susan Louth, but that was it. He said there were no others. Now, Debbie was beyond crushed and shocked, like so much so that she, for once, did not guard her emotions or feelings when she was talking to Tom. Remember, after many, many years of Tom manipulating her, she was very guarded in what she said to Tom so as not to set him off, But yeah, this time she was so heartbroken and just so crushed that she let him have it. She was so upset. But even still, it never crossed her mind to leave Tom. And she certainly didn't think Tom had done any physical harm to Annie. She didn't think in a million years he was capable of that. She was hurt at, the cheating, the lies, and the deception. And the phone call between Tom and Debbie ended with them still being together, and Debbie telling Tom that she just didn't want any more lies. Quote, "So I thought everything was fine and wonderful. From that point on, I never knew there was anyone else. I believed him." Tom also called Kay and let her know, like, hey, you and the girls might want to get out of town for the 4th of July weekend because, yeah, the story's gonna hit the papers. And on July 3rd, Tom's name was officially dropped in the story of Anne Marie's disappearance. But apparently, it wasn't really all that damaging to, his reputation. It had just come out that, yeah, it was Tom who was the attorney who Annie had been dining with, and the article mentioned that, Tom was cooperating with the investigation, and that was that. Meanwhile, on that same day that news broke that it was Tom who Annie had last seen, her siblings and her family, along with members of the public and police, set off on a massive search for Annie, for any piece of evidence of where she might be, of what happened to her. They handed out flyers, and the case was, gaining media traction as well. At that point, Annie had been missing for 6 days. And of course, because it's a high-profile case that's gaining attention, there were lots and lots of tips that came in, but as also usual, the majority of them turned out to be, dead ends. And on July 4th, in, what should have been a celebration, a massive search with over 300 people set out to, search for Annie, any type of evidence, any sign of her at all. And at this point in time, her siblings knew that, if Annie was able to, she would communicate with them in some way to let them know that, she was okay. And if she wasn't communicating with them, that meant meant that she was either incapacitated, injured or something, she was being held against her will and was unable to, or she was dead. So as the investigation plodded on in the first few days, Kim went to Detective Donovan and informed him, of the background of Annie and Tom's relationship, how Annie had been trying to disengage from Tom, how he was not allowing that to happen, how he was kind of a control freak. And she also told Detective Donovan about the strange phone calls she had with Tom in the immediate days after her disappearance. After this, it said Kim kept a pen and pad near her phone so that if Tom ever called her again, she could write down exactly everything he said. Annie's hairstylist, who she was actually supposed to have that appointment with on that Friday when she didn't show up, went to Lieutenant Daniels to tell him what she knew. The stylist was Lisa D'Amico, and she told Lieutenant Daniels that, she and Annie had grown quite close, and they were pretty good acquaintances. And she said that Annie had even confided in her sometimes. I think it's sort of like a bartender thing, right? The hairstylist and the bartender seem to be sort of the go-to professions that people sort of vent to and stuff. Lisa said the last time she spoke with Annie was in May, and Annie had told Lisa how happy she was with Michael. Quote, but she said that Tom Capano was crazy and that he scared her. She wanted to stop seeing him, and they were always getting into arguments about it. He kept giving her stuff. He'd wait for her outside her apartment, and she wouldn't let him in. So I'm not sure if she had told Lisa that she had engaged in an affair with Tom, or maybe she had just told her that that they were just good friends and Tom was misinterpreting? Not sure. Annie told Lisa one time that Tom had, quote, gone crazy, grabbed her, and accused her of ruining his life. Annie told Lisa that Tom had grabbed her by the neck, called her a, quote, slut and a, quote, bitch. And Annie told Lisa that though she was afraid of him, she was going to straight up tell him, no, we don't have any type of relationship or connection at all. Stay the F away from me. Bud Friel of the Friels, who remember, we discussed this, the Friels were very good friends with the Fahys and the Capanos. And because of that, Bud Friel decided to try to talk to Tom. Remember, the Friels considered Annie like a little sister. And Bud Friel had been, good friends with Tom for decades at that point. And he thought Tom should just go down to the police and answer the questions what's the big deal? Just go down and answer their questions, So Bud Friel drove to Marguerite's home in Stone Harbor. Remember, that is where Tom is hiding out. And attempted to talk to Tom. Tried to talk him into going to the police and sit down with them, tell them what you know. Now, Tom wasted no time in telling Bud Friel that, yeah, he did have an affair with Annie, but it was over now, and now they were just really good friends. In fact, he was her best friend, and he just went on and on to Bud about how good he had been to Annie, everything he had done for her. He said the police were only interested in the, quote, dirty little details of their sex life, and he didn't want to answer their questions. It was none of their business. And Bud told Tom, look, dude, this story is gaining traction. It's just going to gain more traction. And before you know it, there's going to be major media outlets in Wilmington. I think you should get out ahead of this and just go talk to the police. But instead, Tom just kept agonizing over different theories as to what could have happened to Annie? Where is she? Why is she missing? That's all he kept, he just kept throwing out theory after theory. And I guess Bud Friel kept sort of poking holes in them. If she left somewhere voluntarily, why wouldn't she bring her wallet? If she checked herself into an eating disorder clinic, which was one of the theories Tom was throwing out there, why wouldn't the clinic at least inform her family she was okay? This story was making the rounds. They would have seen it. And in the end, when Bud Friel left, he felt like he had made no ground with Tom, and he did not succeed in his mission. Now, on July 4th, Tom actually called Bud Friel up and told him that his lawyer, Oberly, was fuming that Tom had talked to him, that Bud could have been wired. And now, Bud Friel was, completely floored by these allegations. What are you talking about? I'm friends with both of you. I just want to find Annie. What are you talking about? Wired? What? And after he got over, that kind of shock and insult, he then asked Tom, okay, what can I do for you as a friend? I want to be your friend. What can I do for you? Tom said that he wanted Bud to arrange a talk with the Fahys. It was important that they know just how good he had been to their sister. Now, it turns out Robert Jr., remember Annie's brother, did agree to talk with Tom, but only only via phone call. But on July 5th, when the time came for Tom to call, no such phone call ever came. Bud called Tom 3 times trying to get a hold of him to see, what's up. And Tom didn't call Bud back until later that evening. Tom said that he decided he wasn't going to speak with Robert after all because he was going to go to the police. He was going to go to them on Monday, July 8th, and he was going to tell them, anything and everything that he knew. He then started asking numerous questions of Bud about, what's being reported? What's in the papers? Because remember, Tom was still up in Stone Harbor at this point. So on the morning he was to go down to the police, Monday, July 8th, Tom called Bud up, told him he was going to meet with his attorneys, and that he would probably be speaking with the police later that afternoon. And unsurprisingly, Tom never did show up to the police to talk. I know you're totally shocked, right? And when Bud talked to Tom later that evening, that Monday evening, Tom just went on and on again about how the police just wanted dirty, intimate details, and he wasn't going to tell him that information. It was nobody's business but his and Annie's. Now, I guess at this point, Bud was feeling pretty exasperated with Tom, and he told him, quote, Tom, I just don't get it. Anne Marie's been missing now for more than a week. They just want to sit down and ask you questions in hopes there might be something you know, and you might not even realize you can be helpful to them. If you're not willing to do that, I have nothing else to say to you. And this would end up being Tom and Bud's last conversation. So July 8th was also the day that the federal government quietly entered the investigation. So the FBI was now joining the case. Then President Clinton had called up Governor Carper and offered, any federal aid that they needed. Now, in actuality, apparently, federal aid is routinely given to states for, cases like this. But, the headlines, dramatizing President Clinton calling up the governor and saying, oh, the FBI is at your disposal, just, it's too much for the press to pass up. So that's how it was reported in media. But in actuality, there was no special circumstances here. I guess it was pretty on par, especially when you have a potential kidnapping case, potentially when it's across state lines. Remember, they didn't know what happened to her at this point. She could have been kidnapped in Philadelphia. But the press, they gotta just, make everything more dramatic than it is. And when it was reported that the FBI was assisting in the case, apparently this is when Tom started to get really nervous. So after staying at his mom's for a while, he went to another friend that he had been generous to. This friend was Brian Murphy. He had even paid for Brian's daughter's college tuition. 'Cause remember, that's what Tom does. That's how he gets his allies, man. He does things for people. And remember, it's not because he's their friend or anything like that. It's because he, wants to cash in a favor one day. So he called Brian up and asked if he could just crash with him, and Brian had, no problem with this. And Tom just went on and on to Brian about how he was a suspect, how worried he was, and he even told Brian that he had received some threatening anonymous letters that accused him of killing Annie. Now, Brian thought that Tom should make a public statement, because he was like, bro, you didn't do anything, and, you're an innocent man, you should come out and make a public statement, talk about these threatening letters. And on July 8th, the two men actually drafted a public statement that Tom said he was going to run by his lawyers and then wanted to release. So it read, in part, quote, "The disappearance of Anne Marie Fahey remains as much a mystery to me as it does to her family and friends. I can only say I share the gut-wrenching emotions of Anne Marie's family and pray for her safe return." He recounted his last night with Annie, pretty much what he told police, and the statement in part continued, quote, "It is difficult to respond to how others may characterize our relationship. Frankly, the nature of our relationship is and will remain a matter between Anne Marie and myself. What is relevant and important is that Anne Marie and I are good friends, and parted company good friends that evening." He finished up the statement recounting how he discovered that she was missing, how, he thought she had just gone off for the weekend, and how he was cooperating with the investigation. He concluded it by saying that he would not be releasing any further public statements. And apparently, Tom did eventually release his public statement, but it wouldn't be for 2 years. So that same day, July 9th, as Tom and Brian were working on their public statement, Tom also called up Robert, Annie's brother, and he left a message for Robert just talking about how desperately he needed to speak with him. And he needed to speak with him not just on the phone, they had to have a face-to-face conversation. Part of the message that Tom left was, quote, "I have some things I want to show you. I have some things I want to tell you. I care for Anne Marie a great deal, Robert. Apparently, from what Buddy's telling me, that hasn't come through, and I don't understand that." He reiterated that he had already talked to the police twice, and he was going to continue to cooperate, but he wasn't going to rehash, quote, ancient history, i.e. his affair with Annie. Quote, "Anne Marie has a right to privacy, and I have a right to privacy, and I am not going to tell them details of things we did a year ago, or 8 months, or all this incredibly personal stuff they want to know from me, okay? Maybe you can't understand that. I mean, do you and Kathleen want to read stuff in the newspaper? Because you know it's going to leak. It's personal. I know I'm rambling, but I would desperately like to talk to you. Please call me Robert. And Robert never did call Tom. He could tell, even just from that message, he could clearly see, like, the BS that Tom was trying to spin, and he didn't want any part of it. He knew Tom wasn't going to tell him the truth, and he's like, you know what? I'm not interested in talking to Tom, because all I want is the truth, and he isn't going to tell me. So remember I said, when the FBI and the federal government, enters the case, it was on the DL, right? It wasn't reported until a little later. No one at all was aware of their cooperation in the investigation, including Annie's siblings and Tom. Now, apparently, they entered the investigation sort of on the DL, because if they officially entered, it would be officially a federal investigation. And that meant nobody could comment on it to the press or even to Annie's family. And they knew that Annie's siblings were like using the press to, keep her story alive and keep tips going and stuff like that. And they didn't want to mess with that at that point. So again, remember, at first, no one was aware of the FBI's participation in Anne Marie's investigation. So FBI Special Agent Eric Alpert had called Detective Donovan on July 2nd, so quite quickly into the investigation, and had offered any assistance. Turns out, yeah, they could. Detective Donovan told Agent Alpert that they were hoping to get some open registers on phone lines, and they wanted open registers on anyone and everyone connected to Annie. Now, the open registers note the time, date, along with, of course, the numbers that call from particular phones. But I guess to get these open register devices, the U.S. Attorney's Office has to be involved. I'm guessing they're probably the ones that I don't know, submit the form or something. And yeah, Detective Donovan was like, yo, we could use some assistance with that. Another person who worked for the federal government also called Detective Donovan, offering his assistance. It was Assistant U.S. Attorney Colm Connolly, who actually knew Donovan personally. Now, Alpert, Donovan, and Connolly would actually end up being the three-man team who, worked this case and worked it for years. So Connolly ended up filing the correct forms and got some open register devices on multiple phone lines, including Tom's. And of course, since he was the last one to see her, since they had crossed state lines in Philadelphia to have dinner, apparently it was super easy for them to get the open registers on Tom's device. Connolly also got a tollback edit for Tom's phones, and this would allow them to see who had called Tom for the past 15 days or so. So they could go back even further and see who had called Tom, who he had called, etc., etc. They're of course specifically interested in the dates between June 27th and June 30th. So as the investigation plodded on into July and more information came out about the case, Tom's affair with Annie became public knowledge. It was... Sorry, dropped my eyeliner there. Like I said, their affair became public knowledge. It was, widely reported that they had, some sort of physical relationship. But even though his affair with Annie was now public knowledge, his affair with Debbie was still completely quiet. Nobody knew he was with Debbie. Tom told Debbie to leave town quite often, especially in the first, early weeks of the investigation. But as we know, Tom loves confiding in women, right? He has, some weird issues with women, am I right? So with Debbie out of town on July 15th and July 19th, Tom called up Kim and talked to her as if they were close old friends or pals or something. Remember, Kim was Annie's best friend. She was aware of just about everything in Annie's life. Her eating disorder, the affair with Tom, how she felt about Michael. She was aware of all this. And yeah, Tom's just calling her up and acting like they are the ones with the close relationship. It was very weird. Kim said that Tom told her of Bud Friel's visit. Quote, he said Bud had told him that he was there on behalf of Annie's family. And that he said, if you have her, could you please return her? Yeah, can you? What? Tom once again talked to Kim about possible theories about what could have happened to Annie. He told Kim that there was a, quote, turf war going on among all the law enforcement agencies that were involved in the case, and that they were just going to bungle the investigation. And he went on about different scenarios that would happen in the case. Annie would be found alive, which would be great. Her body would be found, and it would lead investigators to the direction of her killer. Or she would never be found, and by Labor Day, the pressure would be on the police police to make an arrest, and Tom, would be the fall guy. He then peppered Kim with all kinds of questions. Who had she spoken with? The police? Michael? Kathleen? Robert? Who had she spoken with? He wanted to be sure that the police knew that him and Kim had had dinner where they discussed an intervention for Annie. He went on about rumors that were supposedly flying around Wilmington about Annie's love life and stuff. That, oh, Annie had an affair with Governor Carper. Did you hear that rumor? Oh, a state trooper had harassed Annie. Did you hear about that? There's a neighbor who'd been paying attention to Annie. There was also a guy bothering her who she had worked with years earlier, and on and on and on he went to Kim, saying all these things, oh yeah, did you hear this rumor and that rumor? And of course, Kim was like, what are you, none of this is true though, and no, I haven't heard these rumors, what are you talking about? It's almost as if Tom is trying to manufacture the storyline going on, right? And remember, Kim has her pen and paper by the phone, and she was writing down every little thing that Tom was saying in this conversation, or these two conversations rather, because remember, he called her twice. She said when she was talking to Tom, it was just so weird. It was like he was reading from a script or something, writing down notes and stuff as they were talking. It was very weird. He hammered on and on and on about how good he had been to Annie, how he had treated her, how he made sure she ate and always ordered her extra food. And then he sort of steered the conversation to the date of June 27th. And he began to... Kim felt it was like he was drilling her on the sequence of events that happened. He said he talked to Annie every day, and then Kim was like, well, did you talk to her that Friday, June 27th? And Tom said, quote, Friday? Oh, no. No. I was going to call her on Friday, but I went out for my morning walk, and by the time I got back, I never got around to calling her. Tom said that he felt that, you know what? Me and you, Kim, we know Annie best, and if we just put our heads together, we can figure out what happened to her. I mean, can you believe, it's so clear what this guy is doing. And it's just so funny. He thinks he's just so clever. He thinks he's so smart. He then asked Kim, what she was doing for the weekend. She was gonna go to the shore, and he said it was funny, quote, I was gonna invite you to spend the weekend at the shore with me. Kim was just oh, well, I'm busy. But, Tom pressed her, quote, why don't you go into work late on Monday, and come here Monday morning, and we will put our heads together and try to come up with where she is. And Kim was getting really creeped out at this point, so she just kind of lied and was like, oh yeah, totally, tell you what, I'm gonna get to the shore and I'll call you when I get there. And Tom was like, yeah, great. And yeah, Kim never called him back. At this point, Kim said that she was truly frightened of Tom. She thought that he knew exactly what happened to Annie. Tom then called Kim back a few days later, the 19th, remember? And Kim said, quote, the last thing I remember Tom saying to me is that the thing that upset him so much is that not only did he lose Annie, he was going to lose me as well, which I thought was an odd statement. It wasn't like we were close. Yeah, isn't that weird? Dude, this guy, man, I don't know what's going on in Tom's brain. Now, at the same time, all of this is going down, and it's the first several, weeks and months of the investigation, Bud Friel's prediction was right, and media swarmed all over Wilmington. Shows like Unsolved Mysteries, media outlets such as the New York Times, and just countless other media outlets, both in, TV, news, and radio, showed up in Wilmington because the case was it was just gaining a lot of attention. And all of this, as the investigation continued, just made Tom super uncomfortable. Remember, for Tom's whole rich, privileged, spoiled life, he had been able to set the terms of anything that happened. And now, not only was there national media attention, plus the Delaware police, by this time, the FBI's involvement in the case was known. But even still, Tom was super nervous. He assumed that by the end of summertime, the attention would die down, the next story would break, and, he could get back to normal. And in the meantime, he was adamant about not talking to the police and was insistent that he would never give them any type of personal or intimate information about him and Annie's relationship. And by the end of July, the prevailing kind of thought in most people's minds was, Annie was probably not going to be found alive if she was going to be found at all. She would have contacted someone by now. She didn't have her wallet, her keys, her car. There's no activity on her credit cards. But, even still, Michael and her siblings and friends continue to look for her, right? There's always going to be that 1% hope in their brain, right? That you never know, she could be found alive. But even that, they still wanted to find her to put her to rest. You know what I mean? You want that kind of closure. And at this point, it was very clear that Tom was not cooperating with authorities. And at this point, authorities had nothing to compel Tom to come in. They had nothing. And as you can guess, because this case was super popular and the hit thing, and you've got members of the elite involved. Of course, rumors upon rumors just flew all around. And there were lots of rumors swirling about, like, what happened to Annie? What could have happened to her? Where was she buried? There were whisperings that her body was buried under the new Home Depot that was going under construction at that time. Construction was nearly finished. And the fact that the construction had been supervised by Joey Capano and the commercial division of Capano and Sons added, like, weight to that rumor. I believe investigators may have even searched the property for any sign of the body. Like, that's how much this rumor went around. But yeah, they didn't find anything. And on July 18th, the case was officially made a federal investigation, and the involvement of the FBI was publicly stated and publicly reported, and a federal grand jury investigation officially began. And of course, now that it's officially a federal investigation, Delaware State Police and the other investigators could no longer say anything to anyone, including the press and Annie's siblings. On the 24th of July, Annie's siblings sent a signed letter to Tom, begging him to come out and just tell what he knew. They tried to convince him to, imagine if this was one of your daughters. Quote, "We know you would expect the last person to be seen with your children to come forward and be helpful." They tried to play on his family's prestige. Quote, "Do what your father, Lewis, would expect of one of his sons. Come forward and share all you know about Anne Marie's disappearance." Tom, surprise, surprise, never responded to this letter. Like, are you kidding me? Tom is a narcissist. Like, he thinks he's above every other human, You think playing on, like, his father's name or his daughter's, like, is gonna do anything? Nah. Not with people like Tom, right? Like, this guy is so self-deluded, is so up his own a-hole that he really does think that he's above it all. He's above it all. The rules don't apply to him. He really thinks he's special. And it's like, bro, you're not special. You're a cliche. And more than a little pathetic, am I right? And by the end of July, though, investigators did not have, well, I say investigators, remember it's the three-man team of Connolly, Donovan, and Alpert, were all convinced that Tom was involved in Anne Marie's disappearance. Even though they didn't have, like, a shred of evidence, they had nothing to support this. Just everything told them that Tom was involved in some way. And they believed his motive for killing Anne Marie was the cliched, jealousy, possessiveness, maybe even revenge. Like I just said, Tom's a cliche. But yeah, they had no evidence to prove it. And remember, I just said they were just a three-man team. That was it. That was the team working on Anne Marie's disappearance and her case. The three men continued interviewing anyone and everyone who was connected with Annie and or Tom. And the more they spoke with people and the more they found out just the dynamics of Tom and Annie's relationship, it painted the same picture. And that was of a determined, frightened Annie trying desperately to leave a controlling, insecure, jealous Tom. Now remember, everything that they were finding out so far was in total contrast to everything Tom had told them about Annie. Remember? He was telling them that Annie was spacey, she was a ditz, an airhead, and this was like only Tom's description of Annie. No one else had that same description of her. But you know what they did here is story after story of Tom's bizarre behavior. There was one of Annie's friends named Al Frank who told investigators that he actually witnessed the night that Tom broke into Annie's apartment and took everything that he had ever given her. Remember we talked about that last week? He'd come in the apartment and took a TV, clothes, even a jar of mayonnaise that he had given Annie and said that yeah, well, if we're not going to be together, you don't get this stuff. Yeah, apparently Al here was at Annie's apartment when this happened. At least I'm going to assume it's the same incident, unless this incident happened more than once, which wouldn't really surprise me. Would it surprise you? The investigators dug into Tom's financials, and there was a purchase made on June 29th, 2 days after Annie disappeared. And this purchase was at Wallpaper Warehouse. And this right here, this little discovery right here, would end up being the first break in the case. So the purchase was for $308.99. Now, this purchase was just odd to them because they were like, wait a minute, Tom rents the house that he's in. Who the heck is gonna wallpaper a house that they rent? Turns out Wallpaper Warehouse also did business as air-based carpets, and they sold carpeting and rugs and all kinds of stuff. Agent Albert drove to the location that Tom had went to, and the general manager there was able to verify Tom's purchase. The general manager also verified that Tom was a repeat customer, so the general manager, remembered Tom and knew him. I believe this is where Tom also purchased all of his carpets and rugs when he moved into that house. Remember, part of his lease was he had to cover 75% of the hardwood flooring with carpeting of some kind. I believe air-based carpets is where Tom bought all of that. He had also purchased a room room-size remnant that was a looped weave beige Berber carpet. It was all that was left on a roll that had been sold 3 months earlier. Tom bought the rest of this roll, and this was back in 1995, like I said, when he first moved into his house. So the general manager verified to Agent Albert that Tom had come in on June 29th at 1:36 p.m. and purchased a cheap knockoff rug. And he said that there was nothing unusual about Tom's demeanor or mood or the interaction. It was, it was normal. Now, Detective Donovan was actually able to track down the person who had bought the bulk roll of that beige Berber carpet and was able to get samples of it. Now, investigators didn't know, if this would even be useful, why they're even doing this. But, when you're in the early days of an investigation, particularly one, right, where there's no evidence, nowhere to really start, they're going to collect anything and everything, right? And believe me, it is a good thing that they collected fibers of this Berber carpet. And we'll get into it. So another break in the case came when Detective Donovan interviewed Ruth Boylan, who was Tom's housekeeper. She had last cleaned Tom's house on July 22nd, and before that, she had come and cleaned it on June 24th. She said she was supposed to come to the house on July 8th, but Tom had called to cancel, saying that, we were out of town for the 4th of July weekend, so the house didn't really get messed up. But Ruth told Detective Donovan that she was surprised when she came to Tom's house on July 22nd to clean, because the room off the kitchen had, quote, changed. Now, when asked in what way, she explained, quote, for one thing, the sofa was missing. And this was particularly, remember that gaudy-sounding maroon couch with a pineapple pattern? That was the sofa that was missing. And the carpet had been taken up, and there was an area rug there. Now, she found this odd because the carpet that was laying there previously, not only did it cover the entire room, wall to wall, it was also, practically brand new. It was clean. She didn't know why Tom would replace it, and she didn't know why why he would replace it with an area rug that, covered, not even half of the area that the old carpet had. So that was all very odd to her, and it stuck out. Dr. Sullivan was interviewed once again, and she told investigators that she was almost positive that Annie, if she went to Tom's house that night, it was not willingly. So during their last session on that Wednesday, the night before Annie disappeared, Dr. Sullivan said that they were working on Annie cutting Tom completely out of her life. Now, when told of what Jacqueline the waitress had described and the demeanor of Tom and Annie, Dr. Sullivan confirmed yeah, that sounds a lot like Annie, but she denied, and vehemently denied, that Annie was suicidal. Connie Blake, who was a neighbor of Annie's, also had some information for investigators. So Connie lived in the second floor apartment below Annie's. Annie's was in the third floor. They lived in one of those houses that was built a long time ago, and it's converted into apartment houses. That was the setup that Annie lived in. And Connie told investigators that the glass door that closed off the stairs to her own second floor apartment and Annie's third floor one was always locked with a deadbolt. And Connie said, her and Annie and the other tenants felt secure knowing that, no one could reach the stairway to their apartments without a key to that glass door, which, of course, only the tenants had. And as such, she said that often they would leave their apartment doors unlocked during the day. Oddly, Connie said that Thursday night, the glass door's deadbolt was unlocked. And remember, Annie's own apartment door was locked with a deadbolt. It was switched. Connie said she saw Annie come home that evening around 6 p.m., and she did not see her again. That same evening, Connie was packing for a trip, and she heard footsteps in, Annie's apartment above her. Quote, they weren't high heels, just muffled walking. She said the footsteps sounded like they walked to Annie's bedroom, and Connie said they were, quote, distinctive, and it sounded like it was only one person. And she said when she got back from work the next day on Friday, Annie's car was where it had been parked that Thursday evening when she came home. Now, all of these things that we just recapped enabled investigators to finally secure a search warrant for Tom's home on July 31st. They had their probable cause. They believed Annie had not been harmed or killed in her own apartment, because Connie didn't hear any struggles or anything, just those footsteps. Investigators believe Annie had gone to Tom's home, but she had not gone there willingly. Whether she had been injured or forced there, or just emotionally manipulated into going, they didn't know, but they did theorize and really believe that she did not willingly go to Tom's home that evening. They also believed that once Annie was in Tom's home, something happened in that room that was off the kitchen. They also had a warrant to search Kay's Chevrolet Suburban as well, and this was because Tom had borrowed it. On Friday, June 28th, 8th in the wee early morning hours, Tom had gone to Kay and said that he needed to borrow her car since he was going to have the girls for the weekend, and like it was just better to transport them and all of like their stuff around. They ended up getting lots of hairs and fibers from the vehicle, and at the home, Tom physically left after being served with a search warrant, and he left 2 of his lawyers, because he had a growing team of lawyers, sit at the home and sort of like supervise the search going on. Tom would not return to his home after this search. He told family and friends that there were just too many bad memories and traumatizing memories from the investigators in their search. He couldn't go back there. He moved in with Louis Jr., his brother, before moving in with his mother, Marguerite. So inside Tom's home, investigators found tiny, dark brown flecks in that room off the kitchen. You know, the one that had changed so much, that had that gaudy pineapple couch? There was a fleck found on the baseboard and another on the metal cover at the bottom of the radiator. They also sawed out like portions of the wall to test because the paint in the room also looked suspiciously fresh. They also found what they believed to be blood specks in the laundry room and on the laundry room door. Now, it turns out those flecks they found on the baseboard were, in fact, human DNA, and there was enough there to test. However, the problem they had was they had no DNA of Annie's to test. Yeah, even after scouring her apartment, her bathroom, her toothbrush, her hairbrush, investigators were unable to find like any hair with like a root attached or anything else that would give them Annie's DNA profile. Yeah, her compulsive neatness and tidiness ended up being a hindrance in the investigation. I thought that was incredible. Can you imagine being that clean and tidy? Another thing investigators found odd while searching Tom's home was just how many bleaching and cleaning products there were, especially for like a bachelor who decorated the way Tom did. Now, even more evidence would come to light when Sean Light, who was an employee for Capano and Sons, came to investigators with an interesting tidbit. He said that on July 1st, he was a little like shocked and puzzled when a fellow employee told him that they were supposed to empty the dumpsters that was at a job location located on like Falk Road or something like that. And then this was weird to Sean because this wasn't the normal like trash day. So he went to Louis III, who was Louis Jr.'s son, and like, you know, told him about like, hey, is this right? And so, you know, Louis III then called up his dad on his cell phone and, you know, asked like, hey, do we really empty these dumpsters? Like, this isn't their regular day. They're only half full. Just want to verify that with you. Now, Louis Jr. immediately told his son to get off the phone and that they weren't going to discuss it anymore on the phone. Now, this, of course, piqued Sean and, you know, Louis III's interest, and so they decided to go take a peek at these dumpsters. And all they found was a bunch of, like, discarded, like, construction material. But they did as Louis Jr. wanted, and they had the dumpsters emptied. The trash was hauled off to the dump, while the construction materials were hauled off to a, like, recyclables, like, product, like, landfill. And actually, from August 12th through 16th, because of Sean's information, investigators combed through the dump and the landfill looking for any evidence, anything that may have been, you know, thrown in those dumpsters, but they ended up finding nothing. On August 1st, the News Journal ended up getting copies of Annie's diary, and her deepest, darkest, most personal, intimate thoughts were then plastered on the front page. Now, as you can imagine, Tom had his defenders, his family, his fellow friends in power, who all characterized Tom as a, quote, scapegoat. And I guess this particular line was especially effective especially in the early days of the investigation because, you know, was seen as like, you know, the big bad federal government coming and sticking their nose in our personal business and stuff. You know what I mean? So that line of attack worked quite well in Tom's favor in the media. One headline from the News Journal actually read, quote, FBI uses typical tactics with Capano. Yeah, they were painting the FBI in not a very positive light at all. And all of Tom's defenders said that there was no way Tom was a killer or a stalker. He was only trying to help Annie, and didn't the press and everyone realize how this was going to hurt Tom's career and reputation? Yeah, that was what they were concerned about. Annie's siblings stuck by their sister, and after everything that they themselves saw and experienced with Tom, they firmly believed that he had something, if not everything, to do with their sister's disappearance. Now, as the investigation is moving forward and all this is coming out, Debbie was happy sticking her thick head in the sand, ignoring everything. She refused to read the papers, which Tom told her were full of, quote, lies. She often left town, mentioned that earlier, didn't watch the news, and like the good trained dog that she is, did everything Tom asked of her. She didn't believe he was a stalker or a killer. It just wasn't like him. You didn't think it was like him to cheat, Debbie, and look what you found out. And Tom told her that there was going to be no more lies, and that is what Debbie clung to. She wrapped herself up in that belief that Tom was not, there was no more lies, alright? He was going to tell the truth, there was going to be no more lies. When she was interviewed with police, she lied and said that her and Tom's relationship started after the divorce. Tom, of course, had told her to say this. He had given her a whole script to recite, which she did, and she denied knowing anything about Annie, which of course that was true. She told authorities that she called Tom sometime between 9:30 and 10:30 a.m. that Thursday morning, and she didn't hear from him again until 5 p.m. that evening when he told her that he had like a business meeting in Philadelphia. That night, she called Tom around 10:30, but he didn't answer, so she left a message. He called her back between 11:30 p.m. and 12:30 a.m., and she said he sounded like he always did, just more tired. But in actuality, Tom had snapped at Debbie in this conversation and told her to never, quote, ever leave a message on my voicemail. And Tom berated her over something to do with her job, and he got so angry and flustered that he actually hung up on Debbie. She tried calling him back, but got no answer. But within a few minutes, he had star 69'd her and asked her why she had hung up on him. Then Debbie said, quote, then we both calmed down and said goodnight. She said the next day on Friday, she saw Tom between 8 and 8:30 a.m., and he later called her between 9:30 and 10:30 a.m. that morning. He told her he was playing golf, and she told police she did not see him again until 11 p.m. that night. And it was when he unexpectedly came to her house and crawled into bed with her. And he stayed over at her house until noon the next day, Saturday. Debbie did not know what Tom was doing for most of the day on Friday. Now, investigators found it odd that Debbie never pressed Tom for more details about anything, but they could also tell from their interview that it was clear Tom set the terms in their relationship and Debbie was just the good, dutiful lapdog. Debbie was so trained, in fact, she actually buried that memory of her buying the gun for Tom. And I don't think this was, conscious on her part. It's just, she didn't even connect the gun purchase with everything that was going on. It didn't even occur to her. Investigators asked Debbie if she knew why Tom had removed that couch, along with the room-length carpeting, that Berber carpet. And Debbie just said, quote, oh, he spilled wine. I asked him about it, probably sometime in July. He told me that he had spilled wine on the carpet and on the sofa, too. She also told investigators that she saw a hole in the wall when she was there. So when the traces and tollback edits on Annie and Tom's phones came back, they showed that only one call was initiated from Annie's phone number that Thursday evening. At 11:52 p.m., someone in Annie's apartment called star 69 to see who the last caller had been. It had been Michael, who had called around 9:45 that evening to invite Annie to a friend's house. And investigators knew this because Michael's message was still on Annie's answering machine. And this left investigators wondering, who was in Annie's apartment at 11:52 p.m.? Was it Annie? Was it her killer? Tom had also made numerous calls on Thursday night going into Friday morning. At 12:05 a.m., so technically Friday morning, Tom checked his messages at Saul Ewing, made 2 calls to Debbie, and dialed star 69. And as Debbie just recounted, on Friday, he called Debbie numerous times in the morning. And when he called her later in the morning, he was calling from Marguerite's house in Stone Harbor. And as August rolled on and turned into September, the search warrants just kept coming at Tom. On August 23rd, he was forced to submit samples of his hair and blood. And as the days and weeks went by, Tom was getting more and more frustrated and annoyed with the investigation. Remember, he wasn't accustomed to being in the spotlight. And this was not the type of public attention that he had ever wanted, right? Remember, Tom is a control freak. He likes to dictate every moment of his life. And with this investigation, not knowing what the federal investigators have, and it being in the paper, just really, really got to Tom. Yeah, he was not doing well. He was very, very frazzled, and he had a huge hate for Connolly, Donovan, and Alpert. He especially, for some reason, hated Connolly most of all. Digging more into Tom's financials, investigators found Tom had cashed checks on 2 consecutive days. Consecutive days. One of them was for $8,000, the other for $9,000. Now, at first glance, because they're, investigators, their first thought was that Tom, my lord, I can't talk. Tom was structuring, which is a tactic that I guess drug dealers and other people who don't want the IRS to know their financials do in order to hide money. So any withdrawal over $10,000 requires a CTR, a currency transaction report. So of course, if you want to avoid that, you just don't withdraw the 10,000, right? And as they were looking more into that, they finally were able to find some of Annie's DNA to test against those flecks they found in Tom's home. Apparently she had donated some blood earlier in the year, and they were able to track that down and get her profile. And in late August, it was confirmed those flecks that they found in that room off the kitchen was indeed human DNA, and it was Annie's. Now, investigators would not announce this specific break that Annie's DNA was found in Tom's home for 6 months. But yeah, they found it in August. Another huge break came when they were analyzing all those hairs and fibers they'd collected, right? Remember they collected a bunch of like fibers and stuff from Kay's vehicle? Well, remember those fibers they had collected from that dude who bought the bulk roll of that beige Berber carpet? Well, it's a good thing they did collect those fibers because they had those fibers, and those fibers matched fibers they found in Kay's vehicle. So it was pretty obvious that someone had used Kay's vehicle to transfer that Berber carpet that was missing from Tom's home. I'm not sure if they announced this particular find to the public. I was a little unclear on that. And it would be on August 5th that Tom and his attorneys would be notified that they were officially under investigation by a federal grand jury. So the Anne Rule book I read went into a little bit more about grand jury investigations and how they work and how they're different. So as you may or may not know, whatever happens in these grand jury investigations is private. It's not released to the public. I think affidavits from the investigation can be unsealed later, but yeah, as it's ongoing, there's no press, no public, there's like nothing can be known what's going on behind closed doors. Witnesses aren't allowed to have their attorneys with them, but I guess they're allowed, like the attorneys are allowed to sit outside the courtroom and witnesses can go and consult with them when they're asked a question, which is just kind of weird. That seems like this waste time, but whatever. Now in Delaware, grand juries can sit for up to 18 months. There are 23 jurors in all, at least 16 must be present, and at least 12 have to agree to hand down an indictment. They also only start and gather when the prosecutor needs to elicit testimony. Like, it's not like this consecutive thing where you have to be in there all the time like a regular trial. They just gather and hear testimony when they need to hear testimony. Now, the grand jury for Tom's case would end up listening to evidence for over a year. And remember, since this stuff was private, federal investigation, you know, not only did the press not know what was going on, neither did Tom, neither did Annie's siblings or her friends. They were just stuck waiting in the dark, and maybe the affidavits of the investigation would be revealed. You know, that was where they were stuck waiting. Now, everyone you can imagine, anyone and everyone involved, everyone I've mentioned, even people I haven't mentioned, were all called to testify during this grand jury investigation. And 16-year-old Christy Capano, you know, Tom's daughter, refused to testify. And in January of 1997, she's found to be in contempt of court. Now, this ruling by the 3rd District U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals was actually a landmark decision because this decision decreed that unlike spouses, parents and children could be forced to testify against each other in criminal proceedings. Now, in November, a huge mysterious break came when an informant, or possibly informants, tipped investigators off to something that they could find in the offices of one of Tom's partners at the law firm. So to this day, the identity or identities of the informants remains unknown. No one knows how investigators got this break. All we know is that in November 1996, Agent Albert secured a search warrant for the office of one of Tom's law partners at the firm. Now, hidden in between thick volumes in this co-worker shelf were several stacks of paper. They looked to be like detailed notes and like maybe some quick things jotting down the details of someone's day. Tom's day, actually. The handwriting on the pages was, I guess, clearly and distinctly Tom's. And on one page that was not dated, it read off like an itinerary of someone's day. So it read, quote, 6:30 Jerry, 7 o'clock Kay, 7:15 Track, 7:45 DM, it's probably Debbie, 8 o'clock Lewis with a question mark, 8:30 calls, 8:45 Lewis, question mark, Mac machine, 9:15 to 10:30 drive to Stone Age, they assumed this was Stone Harbor, 10:30 to 11 wait for Jerry, 11 to 12 Marion's, that was his sister, 12 to 12:30 Mom's, 12:30 plus Jerry, 12:30 to 1:30 lunch with Jerry, 1:30 to 3 view property, discuss price and CI sale. sale. 3 o'clock, Jerry leaves. 3:30, Tom leaves. 5 o'clock, dump love seat. 5:30, 17th Street dinner. 11 o'clock, leave kids. And even though it wasn't dated, investigators theorized that this right here, this piece of paper, was an itinerary of Tom's day for Friday, June 27th. So they knew the dumpsters had been emptied on July 1st, and Tom had bought the new rug on June 29th. Since neither of those were on the list, plus what Debbie had told them about when she had seen and spoken with Tom, is what led them to theorize that this was his itinerary for Friday. Now, they wondered, why would Tom make this list? And they wondered if maybe it wasn't to, keep notes for himself. So, if you're trying to make up a story about where you were at a certain time frame, it's easy, especially for investigators, to trip you up, right? Especially if you're lying, to trip you up on little details. And they wondered if maybe since Tom, being a very precise, controlled individual, hadn't written himself notes of some kind so he could remember what he told investigators. That's what they pondered Tom was doing with this itinerary and all these notes. They also theorized that Tom probably knew that his home was going to be searched. He probably knew all this was coming, and that is why he had stashed these sheets of paper with all of this incriminating stuff in a coworker's office, because who would think to search that, right? On another page of the notes were notations of people he had talked to that day. He wrote down that he had called Deputy Attorney General Keith Brady, that same Keith Brady we talked about in part 1, to, quote, make plans to meet for happy hour that evening. So I had pleasant conversation with Laura Cabasco, I think that was Keith Brady's secretary, and asked her to convey message to Keith. Under these notes, Tom had also written, quote, knew of relationship with Anne-Marie, knew I had concluded she was a, quote, head case. He also noted that Keith had helped move carpets into his house in October, and other pages and other notes had mentions of Annie, reminders to himself about what to say about her instability, problems with money, her family problems, how she had told him her innermost thoughts, on top of other notes that seemed to be as if Tom were keeping tabs on Annie's day-to-day life. It was like a stalking diary almost. He wrote on one paper, quote, on Tuesday, June 18th, called for AMF, and Jenny said she had gone home because of a problem. AMF, later same day, advised that trip home was necessitated by bloodstains on clothing from heavy menstrual flow. AMF came to my house for dinner, got salmon from Toscana, irrational, fear of pregnancy, sexual contact. Dinner at Dilworthtown Inn on 620, lobster tail, discussed second job, waitress at fine dining establishment, showed me check register, writes on every line, take-home pay of $844, return to Grant Avenue. There were even more pages with more details and dates and things like this. And it was clear that these were, details and dates and stuff of discussions he had with Annie, either in person or in the phone or email. Details on her day-to-day life. Like I said, it was clearly a stalking diary. I mean, here in writing, they had proof of Tom's obsession with Annie. But in these notes, he also disparaged Annie and her family. He viewed her siblings as not treating her well, and jotted down negative comments about how everyone in Annie's life, everyone, was treating her badly and, quote, driving her crazy. Except for him, Tom, of course. And for that fateful Thursday, Tom had written in these notes, quote, appointment with the doctor, don't like him. Expensive, $55 for 20 minutes. Offer ticket to hair event, I had 12. She chooses Panorama instead. Reservation for 7 o'clock. Call at 6:25 from office to advise on way. Very depressed. And quite some time would pass before any huge news would break about the investigation. Remember, it's federal investigation, so can't really talk about it as it's ongoing. But on January 3rd, 1997, the affidavit investigators had submitted to get that search warrant on Tom's house and Kay's vehicle was released to the public. And with everything in that affidavit, with all this information out there for the first time, I guess, this is when Tom's, good old boy, golden child persona starts getting tarnished. Connolly later said, quote, I think Tom realized for the first time that he was playing out of his league. He had expected all along that he would be dealing with the Wilmington Police Department. Also, for the first time, when this affidavit is released, Debbie's name is mentioned in the public. It's the first time Debbie's name is dropped in relation to this case. The article about the affidavit had mentioned the call Debbie had placed to Tom on June 28th. and mentioned her as a, quote, Capano friend. Now, Tom assured Debbie there was nothing for her to worry about. Things were almost back to normal. But in reality, this investigation was just ramping up. Now, funnily enough, after this January 3rd article was released, the next day at 3 a.m., Connolly's phone rang, but when he answered it, no one was there. The same thing happened to Agent Alpert the next day, again at 3 a.m. And the same thing happened to Detective Donovan on the day after that, again at 3 a.m. Every time, there was no one there. And all the men who had private numbers, and because of, like, their jobs, if you wanted to, like, get their numbers, you would have to work for it, they assumed it was Tom. I mean, he certainly had the clout to get their numbers, and this is so something Tom would do, right? To try to intimidate them. Sorry, I had to throw on my robe. It's a little chilly today. Now, Tom's little pathetic attempts at intimidating these guys just wasn't even working. They knew when they set out in this investigation that, like, they were probably going to make some enemies. You know, the Capanos were a well-loved family in the area, Tom especially. And, you know, he did have his staunch defenders. And because Wilmington is such like a close-knit, small, tight community, everyone in some way or another, it seemed, was connected to Tom, whether it be by blood or friendship. Connolly had actually purchased his home from a very good friend of Tom's. One of his sons had a scheduled preschool class, and the teacher of that class was a very close friend of Tom's and a staunch defender of his. And they were actually asked to withdraw their son from the preschool class. Kay was even the Connolly's pediatrician's nurse practitioner. Yeah, so like everyone in some way had some sort of connection with Tom. But even still, these guys, they didn't care because they just wanted to find out what happened to Annie. Now, to combat the negative coverage that was now surrounding their client, Tom's attorneys released several like notes and messages that were written by Annie to Tom, and it was in like May or June 1996. And of course, if you don't know the context surrounding their relationship, the dynamics of it, who Annie and Tom were, and all the context surrounding her difficulty breaking free of this relationship, these messages would come off as friendly. One read, quote, Tommy, hola amigo, I wanted to drop you a wee note to let you know how much I appreciate all you have done and continue to do for me. You're a very genuine person. We've been through a lot the past couple of years, and have managed, through hard work, determination, and perhaps a bit of stubborn Irishness and Italian tempers, to prevail. You'll always own a special piece of my heart. Love you, Annie. Tom added to his growing team of lawyers and added attorney Joseph A. Hurley to his roster. Tom also struggled with his health as the investigation and the grand jury investigation proceeded. In January, he had a cervical laminectomy in order to stabilize the vertebrae in his neck, and the stress of the investigation aggravated his colitis. He had also been prescribed a myriad of anti-anxiety medications, including Wellbutrin, Paxil, and Xanax. In early September of 1997, Agent Alpert filed another affidavit, and included in this one was a story of Linda and Tom's behavior towards her. Now, it had been reported to the FBI by an informant in 1980, and we know the story behind that. And so you're probably wondering, well, like, what happened then? Like, if it got turned over to the FBI, like, what happened with that? Because remember, nothing happened to Tom. Well, when they were asked about it in 1997, when the info about Linda was released, the members of the Delaware Supreme Court Censure Committee were quick to say that they'd actually never been informed of this information about Linda. They had no clue that this had gone on and been submitted. Now, it said one member of this committee actually had been alerted to this information. And this member just so happened to be one of Tom's bosses at Morris, James, Hitchens, and Williams. Remember that law firm that he had worked at for a while. Now, surprisingly, this member had no comments to make when asked about it in 1997. And I'm not sure when, but I'm pretty sure this specific information was also eventually released to the public in that affidavit. With this new information, and with this new affidavit that Agent Alpert had filed, they were now going to confiscate all of Tom's email. And when they went to talk to the woman who was in charge of like the ID department at Saul Ewing, they learned that Tom asked her if his email had been destroyed. This was only like a couple of days after Annie vanished. She said that he was very dismayed when he learned that email doesn't work that way. Now, by this time, the public opinion towards Tom was starting to tip. The circumstantial evidence was piling up. The bad optics were piling up. And in September, Tom resigned from Saul Ewing. He did not give a reason. Now, as the probe went on, investigators learned that whatever Tom had done that Friday, a good chunk of time had been spent with Jerry, his baby brother, the youngest Capano brother. His name stood out to them in those notes that they had found. Remember, Tom had mentioned Jerry like 5 times in those notes. They also wondered if Lewis Jr. wasn't somehow involved. Now, Joey's name was never mentioned in the notes, so they didn't really look at him too much. It was mainly Lewis Jr. and Jerry that they were looking at. But obviously, right, it was clear that the brothers were not going to turn on Tom unless they had a very good reason. With Lewis Jr.'s history of bribery and corruption and his trouble with the IRS and Jerry's drinking, drugging, and collecting weapons, they wondered if they couldn't put some pressure on these guys. Now, since Jerry was the youngest and was reportedly like the dimmest of the Capano brothers, was said to also be easily the most spoiled, investigators thought that Jerry may be the weak link. So they enlisted the help of the ATF, the Department of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, who were already looking for a reason to get Jerry. And on October 8th, a federal search warrant was served on Jerry and his wife Michelle at their home in Stone Harbor. In the warrant, authorities listed they expected to find evidence of possession of cocaine, distribution of cocaine, or possession with intent to distribute, and possession of a firearm by a drug user. In an unlocked safe in one of their children's bedrooms, police found 10 shotguns, 4 rifles, 4 revolvers, and 8 illegal explosive devices is how they were described. In an unlocked safe in one of their children's bedrooms, guys, there were 2 more revolvers and a shotgun found in the dining room, and they also found cocaine and marijuana. A guest of Jerry's, who was a business partner, was also found to have cocaine and marijuana on their person. They also found Jerry had broken yet another law when they discovered he purchased and then transferred a gun for a friend who was also a felon. Jerry was facing up to 3 years in prison, and his attorney, Dan Lyons, kept going to Connolly and asking like, hey, my client's ready to talk, my client's ready to talk, you ready to deal, you ready to deal? Like, obviously Jerry was very desperate to get out of this situation. But Connolly and the others just kept stalling them, they wanted to make Jerry sweat. Connolly said, quote, "We kept saying we're not ready for him yet. We acted as if we weren't that anxious to talk to him. We said we're not going to bring him in, to borrow a line from The Godfather, until we had an offer he couldn't refuse." And on November 8th, Jerry, along with his lawyer Lyons, finally talked to Connolly, Alpert, and Donovan. So the investigators had theorized Tom had been with Jerry on the day after Annie vanished. One neighbor who they had interviewed in Stone Harbor said that they recognized Tom and saw Kay's vehicle parked in Jerry's driveway early that morning. Driveway. Early that morning. Talking is hard. The neighbor also said that they saw Tom and Kay's vehicle parked at Jerry's house, like, throughout most of the day. Now, investigators believe that Jerry knew where Annie's body was, and they thought he may be able to shed some light on what happened to her. Now, Jerry agreed to talk, and in exchange, he signed a plea deal, which enabled him to skate out on any prison time and instead receive 3 years probation. He also asked for and received protection from prosecution for his sister Marion, her husband, and his mother, Marguerite. But investigators were completely unprepared for the tale Jerry was about to tell them. So in February of 1996, Tom borrowed $8,000 from Jerry. Jerry said, quote, he said that 2 people were extorting him, a girl and a guy. Tom told his brother the couple were trying to, quote, ruin his career. Tom described the girl as, quote, crazy, and said that he did not have a relationship with her. In addition to the money, sometime between February and June, Tom asked Jerry for a gun. Jerry offered him a 10mm, and he showed his brother how to fire it. He gave it to his brother unloaded. When Tom gave it back later, it was unfired and was in the exact same condition in which Jerry gave it to him. Tom also asked Jerry if he knew someone who could, quote, break somebody's legs. Jerry said he did, but nothing ever came of that. Now, Tom told Jerry about the couple that was extorting him. Quote, he told me he was afraid for his life, that he was afraid he was going to get beaten up by this girl's boyfriend if he didn't pay them the money. Tom also told Jerry that the woman had threatened his kids. Quote, she had threatened him several times about hurting the kids at the bus stop or doing something else to them. He said that if this girl or this guy hurt his kids and he killed them, could he use the boat? Jerry owned a boat, and Jerry continued on, quote, and I didn't. I just blew it off because I didn't think he was serious. I just thought he was blowing off steam. Jerry recounted that around 6 a.m. on that Friday, June 28th, he walked out of his house to find Tom in his black Jeep parked in his driveway. He was surprised at this, but, walked to his brother, who was in his Jeep reading a newspaper. Tom asked Jerry if he could get a hold of his boat. Jerry said, quote, did you do it? And Tom nodded and then asked for Jerry's help. Quote, I told him I didn't want to get involved, that I had a beautiful wife and kids and a great life, and I didn't want to ruin my life. He said, don't leave me cold. Don't leave me flat. I need you, bro. Stuff like that. Now, Tom suggested that he could just use Jerry's boat by himself, but Jerry knew Tom knew absolutely nothing about boating, nothing about like aquatics, and so he was like, yeah, I'm not giving you my boat to use by yourself. In the end, though, Jerry agreed to help Tom, who he believed had killed the supposed extortionists. They agreed to meet up at Tom's house. And when Jerry got to Tom's house and went to the garage, quote, I saw a cooler and a rolled up rug. He said the rug was very long, about 3/4 of the size of the garage, and the cooler was also very large, about 4 feet long by 2 feet wide. And it was one of those like really large coolers that like fishermen use. Jerry said that the cooler also had a chain wrapped around it, and the chain looked brand new. There was a lock on it, of course. Jerry said they took the cooler to his boat, Summer Wind, which was docked in Stone Harbor. Jerry said he remembered that the cooler was extremely heavy, and he heard what he thought was ice rattling around inside. Can you guess what was in that cooler? Jerry said he then steered the boat out into the Atlantic Ocean, about 70 miles offshore. So once they were quite a ways offshore, Jerry stopped when his equipment read that the water was about 198 feet deep, and once they were in this area, Jerry said Tom threw the cooler into the ocean, but it didn't sink. Jerry then got out his shark gun and tried to shoot at it, but that didn't work either. He put a couple bullet holes in it. He would later testify that he saw a reddish pink fluid come from the bullet hole that he had made. Now, the theory was that though the dead don't bleed, the ice inside would have absorbed any blood if someone had put like, a dead body in there. And the longer that the body in there had lived, the greater amount of blood there would be, right? That the ice would absorb and then drain as it melted. But the color Jerry described seeing, I guess, was much too pale for the blood to have come from like a live body. Chances are that the body was long dead when it was put in that cooler and Jerry shot at it. Jerry then told investigators that he pulled the boat up alongside the cooler, killed the engine, told Tom he was on his own, gave his older brother 2 anchors that were in the front of the boat, then turned his back and didn't watch what Tom did next. But I guess he could make a lot of assumption based on the sounds Tom was making. Quote, I was telling him this was really wrong. Seems to me like he was opening up the cooler, fighting with the rope, he meant chain, and the tide, and throwing up, and tying the anchors to something. Jerry asked Tom if he was finished. He was. Jerry said that when he turned around, quote, I saw a foot sinking into the deep. He said he also saw a little bit of a calf. He said he also saw blood coming out of the cooler. And on the way back to shore, Jerry said he and Tom dismantled the cooler. They broke it into 2 pieces and threw it into the ocean as they went back to shore. And once on shore, they drove to Wilmington. Once there, Tom asked Jerry's help in moving a sofa. The dark maroon one with that awful pineapple pattern. Now, when asked if he saw any blood on this sofa, Jerry said he saw a basketball-sized stain. Quote, there was a stain. He, meaning Tom, said he had cleaned it. I said, you better cut a piece out of it before you throw the sofa away. The brothers then broke off the arm of the sofa, and this was so it would look damaged enough to be discarded. He was basically saying, Tom, you might want to destroy this to the point that, no one would want to keep it and maybe, restore it or something. Now, when they exposed the couch's foam beneath, there was blood, but it hadn't, penetrated too deeply. Jerry said the blood was on the top right side of the couch, or where someone's shoulder, maybe neck area would be. The brothers loaded the damaged sofa in the back of Kay's vehicle and took it to the dumpster at Capano and Sons. Tom then gave Jerry a full story to tell if he was ever questioned about this. And Jerry had actually written all of this down on a Post-it and written down and put it in his wallet so that he would have it for reference, but he wasn't reciting from that now. So after Jerry's confession, a charge that investigators had found on Tom's MasterCard now made sense. So on Sunday, April 20th, 1996, at 3:15 p.m., Tom had bought a 162-quart styrofoam cooler, and he had bought it from the Sports Authority. And 2 days after speaking with Jerry, Lewis Jr., along with his attorney, Catherine Rucker, also sat down to speak with investigators. Lewis also signed a plea agreement. He pled guilty to tampering with a witness in exchange for 1 year probation. And in exchange for this plea agreement, Lewis admitted that his testimony during the federal grand jury proceedings was a lie. He had lied to protect Tom, and he now agreed that he would tell everything he knew about Annie's death. Now, Lewis said he had no knowledge of her death until Sunday, June 30th, and this is when Tom called his brother in the morning, asking him to come over. This must have been when Tom was on the phone with Kim. Remember, he abruptly got off the phone with her because his brother had come over? It was probably this right here. So when Lewis Jr. arrived, Tom told him all about how the cops had come in the middle of the night, asked him questions, and he was very frazzled. Lewis said, quote, he told me that he had had a relationship with Anne Marie Fahey, and that she was anorexic and bulimic, and a troubled person, that he had stopped seeing her, and he didn't want his wife Kay to find out about their relationship. He also told me that after he had dinner with her that evening, they went back to his house. While he was upstairs using the bathroom, when he came down, she had slit her wrists and had gotten blood, a superficial amount of blood, on the sofa. Apparently, Tom told Lewis Jr. what he and Jerry had done with Annie's body, and he asked Lewis to have the dumpsters emptied. Now, of course, he was curious after this discussion, and so Lewis Jr. had driven to the dumpster himself to check it out, but all he saw was the couch turned upside down and, broken. Now, it turns out Lewis forgot to have it emptied when Tom asked, and when Tom called him on Monday morning, Lewis told him, oh, shoot, man, my bad, I had forgotten about it, I'll go ahead and do that right now. Now, Tom said he was concerned because, quote, Anne Marie Fahey had not shown up for work. He was concerned that the police might start looking around and could get the dumpsters. Tom also told Lewis that in addition to the sofa, he had also disposed of some of Annie's personal belongings, along with a gun in there. Now, Lewis said at this point he firmly believed in his brother's innocence, and he firmly believed Tom's story that Annie had somehow, committed suicide. Now, sometime later, I guess Lewis asked Tom, what happened to the beige Berber carpet, and, did that have blood as well? Quote, he told me he had disposed of some carpet at the Holiday Inn over in New Jersey. It was cut up and put into plastic bags. Now, it turns out the Capanos owned this Holiday Inn, so Tom told Lewis that he had asked the manager there to empty their dumpsters, even though it wasn't the day for them to be emptied. Lewis also recalled a conversation that he had with his older brother on August 29th, 1996. It was the morning of Lewis's grand jury testimony. Quote, I was just getting out of the shower. It was the morning of my testimony, and he came in and basically asked me to provide him an alibi for Friday morning, to say that he had come to visit me on Friday, June 28th. Tom even suggested a script that Lewis could follow, because Tom loves giving people directions. Quote, I would say that he just put personal belongings in there, meaning the dumpster, because he didn't want his wife, Kay, to know he was having a relationship with Anne Marie Fahey. Tom also told Lewis to not disclose that the sofa was in the dumpster, and Lewis said he recalled a separate conversation that he had had with their other brother, Joey, several weeks prior to this. Quote, I just asked him if he had taken care of the anchor, and he told me that he had, meaning that he had replaced one of the anchors that was on my brother Jerry's boat, and apparently Jerry had told Lewis that Tom had used his boat's anchors to get rid of the cooler. And I guess by November of 1996, Jerry's resolve was weakening, and this is when he broke down and confessed what he and Tom had done to Lewis. Jerry told Lewis that Tom had come to him looking for a gun, and quote, anybody who could break somebody's bones. And he told me that he took my brother Tom out on a boat in Stone Harbor and disposed of Anne Marie Fahey's body. Tom had said to him that he had been blackmailed by this woman, etc., and if he killed her, could he just go for a boat ride with Jerry? Jerry didn't believe Tommy was serious. Now, Jerry and Lewis were not allowed to tell anyone about their testimonies to investigators. They were not allowed to say anything. Now, it was said during his confession to investigators, Lewis, was calm, cool, and collected, never really, was emotional, but Jerry was, openly crying and weeping. It was very clear he was conflicted. He hated that he was ratting out his brother. On November 10th, 1997, the FBI put a 24-hour surveillance on Tom, and only 2 days later, on November 12th, Tom was arrested. Tom had been spotted at his brother's Joey's house, loading suitcases into his Jeep. He was going to go to Philadelphia, and from there, who knows? Investigators thought Tom was making a run for it. And that is when they knew that it was time to make an arrest at that point. And they wanted to get to him before he got to the airport, before he even crossed state lines into Pennsylvania. Because once he crossed state lines, he would go before a magistrate and it would just slow the entire process down. The investigators got to Tom while he was still in Delaware, and he was taken into custody without incident. Now, it turns out he was merely just driving Joey and his wife to the airport, and he was actually going to go to Debbie's that night to have a dinner. But regardless, Tom was now officially arrested for Annie's murder. And with Tom's arrest, apparently, the Capano family reputation was, officially in the ground. Now, the cooperation of Lewis and Jerry was reported, and this caused a major fracture in the Capano family. So Lewis, Jerry, and Joey's wives all stood behind their husbands. Lewis sent out a public statement via his attorneys, just pretty much stating that, he had voluntarily given the information to the feds. It helped lead to the arrest of his brother. And the Tom Capano that was being revealed now was not the brother that he knew and grew up with. Now, Marguerite, the boy's mother, was absolutely disgusted and pissed off at Lewis and Jerry. She couldn't believe that they would betray their brother, her baby boy Tommy, like that. Tommy had been through so much, and now he'd been betrayed by his own flesh and blood, and she was pissed. Debbie also stood by Tom. She, like Marguerite, didn't at all believe that Tom was a stalker or a killer. Now, the day after Tom's arrest on November 13th, investigators were handed a crucial piece of evidence. And it's pretty wild how they came across this evidence, all right? Now, Donovan and Albert were sitting in Albert's office when a call came in. Albert said, quote, "There was this guy on the phone. I wasn't too enthused when he said his friend had found a cooler in the ocean more than a year earlier. But then I asked if there was anything distinctive about it. And he said that it didn't have a lid when the guy found it. I motioned Donovan over at that point. And then the guy said, well, it has a bullet hole in it. That was all it took. Bob and I were out of the office and on our way." They went to Smyrna, where the caller, Ron Smith, lived. Now, Ron had been reading about the case when he suddenly remembered about his friend finding the cooler. This friend was a fellow fisherman, a man named Ken Chubb. Now, Ken had shown Ron the cooler when he had first found it. They determined that there were indeed bullet holes in it. They were both hunters, and so they knew bullet holes when they saw it. Ron said, quote, "As a matter of fact, I stuck my finger in one. It was made by a 12-gauge shotgun." Ken had actually found the cooler in the ocean over 4th of July weekend, 1996. Isn't that amazing? Donovan and Albert then headed over to Ken, who still had the cooler. He had put it in a shed, he had actually restored it and was using it. Now, Ken told them that when he found the cooler, it immediately struck him as odd that there were bullet holes in it, especially because it was like a brand new, nice cooler. He said there was also a, quote, pinkish looking stain on the bottom of it, which wasn't too odd because, right, like I said earlier, these coolers were usually used by fishermen to store their fish, and fish bleed. So Donovan and Albert took the now patched up cooler, Ken, remember I said, had patched up and was currently using it, and they hauled it to the evidence lab. So like with most items that are made, right, it's very easy to trace back these items, like not just track it to the store it was sold, but like track it to the factory it was made at and all that, right? Like it's pretty wild how far you can like trace this stuff back. They discovered that the cooler Ken had found was a 162-quart Igloo styrofoam cooler. Did I say styrofoam? I meant styrofoam. Styrofoam cooler that had been shipped and sold at the Sports Authority store that was located across the Concord Mall in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, since Tom vehemently denied both Jerry and Lewis's statements, investigators set to work to try and prove what they had said, particularly Jerry, was true. So they already had the neighbor who lived across from Jerry who verified that Tom was in his brother's driveway early that Friday morning. They were also able to get surveillance footage of Tom withdrawing money from an ATM machine. This was an ATM machine that Jerry said that they had stopped by, and they had surveillance footage of Tom withdrawing money at 8:41 a.m. A worker who did lawn care for Jerry's home in Stone Harbor, named Gary Barber, had entered Jerry's home shortly before 9:30 a.m. that same Friday morning. He had gone to replace like a sprinkler head and like, I don't know, revise something with the sprinkler system, and because he had to like mess with the timer and the actual sprinkler system itself, he had to enter Jerry's home. But when he entered it, he accidentally set off the alarm and he didn't have the code. And it was close to 10 a.m. when a police officer finally showed up and they took care of it, got the code shut off, and then the police officer, along with Gary, who was now done, left the home. And this told investigators that Tom and Jerry must have not shown up to his house until after this incident. Otherwise, they would have run into all this chaos, right? Investigators also had a problem in that they didn't know how Annie had died. They initially thought maybe Tom had bludgeoned her to death with an object, but everything at his house had tested negative for blood. The gun Jerry had lent to Tom hadn't been fired. It was in the exact same condition in which Jerry had lent it to him. And investigators then spent countless hours going over gun purchase receipts because they were like, okay, if he didn't bludgeon her to death, maybe he shot her. That's why he was asking about the gun to Jerry, right? And so that was the theory that they were going with, like maybe it was with a gun. Since they obviously didn't use Jerry's gun, they decided to pore over gun receipts and see, did Tom purchase a gun at any point? Which of course, as we know, he hadn't. But when they were looking over gun purchases made in the area, they did find that gun purchase that was made by Debbie on May 13th. And it was very clear to investigators at this point that Annie's murder, however it happened, was not a crime of passion. It was not some spurned emotional thing. Like Tom had bought the cooler in April. He had asked Debbie to buy the gun in May. He had talked to Jerry about extortionists and gun and stuff, like all the way back in February. Like the evidence was clearly mounting up that Tom had planned this. He had also come up with that extortionist story to tell Jerry on top of borrowing money from him, which was really odd. Like Tom had over 6 figures in his bank account. Like he paid Jerry back the very next day. Like why ask his brother for this money? And investigators believed that this was all a ruse, that Tom had purposely asked Jerry for this money so that, of course, he could then spin the story about the extortionists, and then Jerry would have a very firm memory of this conversation to tell investigators when they talked to him later. That was what investigators were theorizing. Like I said, they were pretty sure that Tom had methodically and maliciously planned Annie's murder. On November 22nd, 1997, the federal grand jury formally indicted Tom on state charges for the first-degree murder of Annie. He was held without bail. A bail hearing would be set for February the next year, was placed in segregation behind bars, and for the first time in his life, the rich, spoiled, golden child that was Tom Capano had to contend with no TV, no radio, a limited number of books a month. He only could get 6 books a month, limited visitation time, being locked up 23 hours a day, only having an hour of day of rec time. And man, you want to talk about culture shock? This must have been a huge culture shock for someone like Tom. Are you kidding me? Not just the rich spoiled thing aside, the narcissist that Tom is, the fact that he has dictated not just his own life, but all of those around him for, God, decades at this point, must have been a huge shock for someone like that. While in prison, Debbie, again, Tom's ever-dutiful, loyal dog, tried her best to please him, even as he was locked away behind bars. Even still, she was still doing everything she could to please Tom. She couldn't visit him. That was reserved for his daughters and other family. But he called her every evening, and Debbie would make sure to be there to take his phone calls, even if she had to rearrange her whole schedule. During one conversation, though they hadn't talked about the case, Debbie just had to ask a question that had been nagging at her. She had remembered at some point, she had remembered that gun that she had bought for Tom. And it was in this phone conversation that she asked Tom, hey, whatever happened to that gun? And Tom, very sternly and quickly, said, quote, "Please don't mention that on the phone. I don't want to discuss anything like that on the phone or about the case." He was very agitated. Tom was also encouraging Debbie to go out with other men like he always had been and tell him about the sexual encounters she would have. And he wanted all of the gross, lucid details. Apparently he had always been obsessed with bodily fluids and the bodily responses from women he was intimate with. And I don't know, I guess he seemed fascinated by menstrual cycles and nothing seemed too personal for him to ask about or talk about. And I guess this behavior just continued with his phone calls and letters to Debbie. They were very long letters too, full of pornographic details and descriptions and just filled with all kinds of sexual innuendo. I'm gonna read one and yeah, just gonna let you know, it's gross, dude. I thought it was gross. So one letter to Debbie read, quote, "Dear Deb, it's 11:57 p.m. and with any luck, you're naked right now on all fours, with your dinner date making you come like crazy, doggy style. Actually, you say something in your Monday night letter, which arrived tonight, about having your period. Okay, so maybe you're naked anyway, so he can admire your magnificent body on your knees, with his dick in your mouth, while he sits in a living room chair, giving him the best blowjob he's ever had. The thought of these things made me have 2 relaxation sessions since I found out about your date, and one of them was in the middle of the day today, while I was standing up in a corner of my cell." Blech. It was so gross. On January 28th, 1998, while Tom is locked up, prosecutors interviewed Debbie, wanting to know about her gun purchase. Now, of course, Tom had given her a story to recite, right? Surprise, surprise. He told her to tell them that, she'd bought the gun because of the crime wave occurring in Wilmington. She was a single mother living with children. And Tom disapproved of her having a gun. She just bought it for protection. That's what she was telling prosecutors. Now, at this interview, it was quite clear that Debbie was full of it. She wasn't an actress or a practiced liar. These are professional investigators and prosecutors, right? They know for the most part when people are lying. And Debbie was really obvious to them. So they started pressing her a little bit. She eventually admitted that the relationship with Tom went back way before the divorce, admitting that her grand jury testimony was in fact false because she had said that it had started after the divorce. They also slowly started chipping away at her story with the gun and her reasoning for buying it. She said she purchased the gun in the winter or spring of 94 or 95. She couldn't remember. And she once again recited the script that Tom had told her. She lied, quote, "I remember coming home on the very last day of school in June. My son was in my room. It," meaning the gun, "was locked in a suitcase, but I was really nervous about him finding it, so I got rid of it, and I updated my alarm system instead." And get this. This is how she told prosecutors and investigators how she disposed of the gun. She said she dismantled it, put the pieces in separate bags, and had thrown it, along with the bullets, into a trash can on Friday, June 10th. 2.5 weeks before Annie disappeared. Like, isn't that so ridiculous? She also lied and said she never lent Tom the gun. And this interview was said to have been pretty disastrous. Like I said, it was very clear to these professionals that Debbie was lying and was full of it. It was very easy for them to, poke holes in what she was saying, and it was just so obvious. Tom was apparently very angry with how Debbie conducted herself in this interview. He told her how stupid she was in his letters. And it is said after this interview right here, this is when things start to turn in Debbie's mind a little bit. She starts realizing the real life jeopardy and consequences that she was putting not just herself in, but her own children as well by lying for Tom. And this realization that Debbie had, right, that was starting to have and would continue to have, really bit Tom in the ass when his bail hearing came in February of 1998. So Debbie, who was, I guess, integral to Tom getting out, she was supposed to be some sort of star, maybe character witness or something for the defense, did not show up for Tom's bail hearing. So for days, for weeks before this bail hearing, Tom had written to Debbie, gaslighting her. He would try to tell her, remember, no, you saw the cooler at my house a long time ago, remember? So he was doing stuff like that, telling her how stupid she had been in that interview, specifically hammering her about the asinine way that she described how she discarded the gun, told her what she should say exactly at his upcoming bail hearing, point for point what she should say. He wrote to her like a child and told her step by step what would happen once she got into the courtroom, even telling her what to do, what she needed to do after her testimony. But, Debbie was shaken by that interview with prosecutors. And remember, I just said, little doubts started creeping into Debbie's mind. So she dropped her attorney, who Tom had actually found, and found a new one with her ex-husband's help. Her new attorney was Tom Bergstrom. And I guess this right here was the first time in Debbie's life that she was actually taking charge, all right? This was a crucial first step. Yes, Debbie was having her come to Jesus moment. She was finally seeing through Tom. Yes. Thank you, Debbie. Thank you. Now, said Tom was dumbfounded, stunned, flabbergasted when he was informed that Debbie was not going to testify at his bail hearing. And he was even more stunned when she actually didn't show up. Tom's bail ended up being denied, and he was to remain behind bars until his trial. Now, after this, he bombarded Debbie with phone calls and letters, chastising her, manipulating her. We know Tom's arsenal here. He whipped out everything in his arsenal, pleading, manipulating, gaslighting, whatever he had to do to get Debbie back on his side. He even suggested that she fire Bergstrom. He did not like that she had gotten her own attorney, and Bergstrom was very good. And he, of course, was going to care about Debbie, his client. Pretty sure the original attorney that Tom had found for Debbie was a very good friend of his. But all of these tactics were not working. And finally, in very, very late February of 1998, Debbie, along with Bergstrom, decided to sit down with investigators and prosecutors and tell the truth. And she told them everything, even the bizarre sexual encounters that Tom had made her have, even though that awkward one that she had with Keith Brady, who, by the way, just so happened to be the boss of the prosecutor who would prosecute Tom, Ferris Wharton. She handed over all of Tom's letters that he had sent her from prison to them, even the ones with the embarrassing sexual innuendo and descriptions and stuff. But remember, these letters also contained explicit, blatant instructions for Debbie to lie. She also reluctantly agreed to have a recording device attached to her phone so that, they could monitor any phone calls that Tom's made to her. And from February 27th to March 3rd, all of the phone calls Tom made from the prison were recorded. But this, I guess, right here was pretty difficult for her. She was still trying to break away from this dude who had had her under a spell for what are we, 15 years or so now? Small steps, baby steps, right? And this right here, recording the conversations, was just too much for Debbie, and she asked them to can we just stop? I can't do this anymore. And so they took off the wiretap on her phone and also prevented any numbers from the prison from calling her number. Now, let's get a little bit into Tom's little activities that he did while he was behind bars. So Nick Perillo, or maybe it's Perillo? Either way, Nick, all right, he was an inmate serving time with Tom, right, behind bars. He was a struggling drug addict and a con man, and was one of the inmates who agreed to call Debbie on Tom's behalf. So remember, inmates, they're heavily monitored behind bars. You can only have so many phone calls and whatnot, right? And the reason Tom was able to call so frequently is he would often barter or bribe inmates for their phone privileges, or he would get other inmates like Nick, to make phone calls on his behalf. Now, surprise, surprise, Nick turned out to be a snitch, and he turned snitch on Tom, and he called up Wharton, who again, remember, would be the prosecutor who prosecuted Tom, and informed him that Tom was very angry at Debbie. He had referred to her as a, quote, stupid dumb bitch, and on March 4th, Nick informed Wharton that Tom had asked him if he knew anyone who would want to burglarize Debbie's home. Quote, he told me it'd be easy picking. He has the key and will give the alarm code to me to send her a message. Debbie was going to be gone, and Tom, wanted her home burglarized in order to send a message to her, right? He also wanted to scare her from further cooperating with investigators. He ended up drawing, I think it was 6 pages worth of very precise, detailed maps of Debbie's home, pointing out, where she had not just financial valuables, but sentimental ones. He wanted them to destroy those too, to really mess with her. He knew where the sex toys and pornography and stuff were stashed, and only he and Debbie knew where she had kept them. He told Nick where those were stashed, and he wanted those specifically destroyed and taken. Again, as a message to Debbie that, hey, this was me who did this, and this is what happens when you cooperate with investigators. He wanted a full-blown scare. And, of course, Nick not only told Wharton everything that Tom was planning, he also handed over those drawings of detailed maps that Tom had drawn. And Debbie said that she was chilled but not super surprised when she was informed. And she, of course, ended up moving out of that house. Now, not dissuaded by his failed burglary attempt, Tom then went to Susan Louth for an ally. Remember, that was his legal secretary that he was having a very physical, passionate sexual relationship with, and he went to her to see if maybe she would be an ally for him, and she was firmly in his corner. He told her that she should start some nasty rumors about Debbie around town, and that Susan should also testify for him and testify how physically weak Tom was. I guess Jerry was saying that he did not help Tom, load the cooler into the vehicle, so Tom had a vested interest, right, in painting it as he was physically incapable of moving that cooler on his own, and he thought Susan, could add to that. Like he did with Debbie, Tom wrote to Susan with very explicit, detailed instructions. He told her to, quote, remember an incident wherein she helped him move a dining room set. She wrote back, quote, I do remember how heavy the dining room table was. I remember coming to your house and helping you move the table and chairs. I was sore for a week. He also, of course, had his daughters firmly in his corner. He had tried to claim that the blood found in the home had been from one of them, and then was outraged when prosecutors then wanted warrants for their blood, to rule it out. And like he had with Nick with contacting Debbie, Tom enlisted the help of a fellow inmate to contact his daughters. This inmate, Harry Fusco, contacted Tom's daughters for him. And by the way, I wasn't even going to bring this little part up, but Harry here was a sex offender. Yeah, was a registered sex offender. And Tom knew this, but yeah, he still had Harry contact the girls, not just via phone calls, but letters as well. Harry even had photos of Tom's daughters hanging up in his cell. Disgusting. Disgusting. Now, Tom's anger also had time to really escalate as he sat behind bars. He talked to yet another inmate, Wilfredo Tito Rosa, and he talked to him about, quote, taking care of some enemies that he had. And on this list of enemies was Tom's own baby brother, Jerry, who he considered had, quote, ratted him out. Debbie was on the list, as was Connolly, who was actually number 1 on Tom's hit list. So remember, I told you, dude, Tom hated Connolly, and, still no one really knows why. He was one of a 3-man team investigating Tom. So, yeah, no one knows why he had such a specific hate on for Connolly, but he did. So Wilfredo, while always intending to take Tom's money, never intended to actually go through with this stuff, especially hitting off a federal prosecutor, you know what I'm saying, with Connolly. So Wilfredo contacted Connolly, who was already aware of the attempted burglary hit on Debbie, and informed him of Tom's intentions. And on August 31st, 1998, Tom was then indicted on 3 counts of criminal solicitation for the 2 murder plots against Debbie and Jerry. Apparently he had given up on Connolly, and for the plot to burglarize Debbie's house. Now this, of course, hit the papers, and Tom's defense, in order to try to spin it in their favor, insisted that these murder plots weren't real, these plans weren't real. Tom had intended intentionally been housed with known prison snitches and inmates, and they goaded Tom into this. They sort of like spurned it on. They enticed Tom into wrongdoing. That was how his legal team was spinning it. Now, by this time, Hurley had exited Tom's legal defense, and it was suddenly without explanation, but heading into his trial, he still had a whole team of lawyers. He had Oberle Still, another attorney named Gene Marr, an old friend, an attorney named Jack O'Donnell, and an attorney named Joe O'Terry. And Tom's highly publicized and reported on case finally went to trial on October 6th, 1998. And this is actually when they began jury selection. His trial wouldn't start in earnest until October 26th, and it would last for 12 weeks. I mentioned this before. He was prosecuted by Deputy Attorney General Ferris Wharton, and Connolly was cross-designated as an assistant U.S. attorney and was assigned as co-counsel with Wharton. So Wharton and Connolly sort of co-prosecuted Tom together. Tom would be judged by Superior Court Judge William Swain Lee. Now, when the trial started, no one knew what Tom's defense was going to be. All people knew was that the defense team had tried to file a lot of motions to get things dismissed before the trial, and all of them but one had been dismissed. They wanted to change a venue. That didn't happen. They wanted to disqualify Jerry Lewis Jr. and Debbie from testifying. That wasn't happening. They tried to argue that any evidence found at Tom's house was fruit of the poison tree because the affidavit was, it was illegal or something, but that was thrown out. They wanted ridiculous things like forbidding the Fahey family from sitting in view of the jury, and also wanted the Fahey family to not show any emotion during the trial. And yeah, all of these motions were denied except for one. Judge Lee allowed the Department of Corrections to release Tom's medical records. Now, the prosecution, again, made up of Wharton and Connolly, were determined not to, overtry this case. This was a huge case, been reported on immensely, a lot of emotions running high, and they knew that's probably what the defense was going to try to harp on is the emotions of it, and they weren't going to do that. They're you know what? We're going to let the facts speak for themselves because that says way more than anything else. So during the trial, they methodically went over Tom's Friday morning, step by step, recounting everything they had learned, showing receipts, the photo of Tom at the ATM. They attempted to break down the relationship between Annie and Tom and sort of get into the complexities and nuances of it, which is what we've been doing. And to that end, they of course had to show the many diary entries, emails, and letters between Annie and Tom. They then tried to reconstruct Annie's last day, specifically her last evening, after she had dined with Tom in Philadelphia. Did they return to her place or go to Tom's? Wharton pointed out that someone had been in Annie's apartment between 9:45 and 10 p.m. because remember, her neighbor downstairs heard someone walking. And remember, someone else was in Annie's apartment at 11:52 p.m. to dial star 69. Wharton then pointed out that it was strange that at 12:05 a.m., Tom decided that was the best time to call and check his work voicemail. And he theorized Tom did this on purpose so that he could be placed in his home at that time. Now, the defense, of course, attacked Annie's character, used parts of her emails and letters and Tom and her's relationship out of context. They painted her, of course, as a grown woman who knew exactly what she was doing when she got involved with Tom Capano. They implied she was stringing Tom along, using him for his wealth and gifts. Words such as, quote, Irish temper, promiscuous, and neurotic were all used to describe Annie by the defense. They attacked Jerry's character as well, painting him as a drug addict and a, quote, boozer, trying to say that because of all the drugs and alcohol, he was unreliable, his memory was unreliable. They said Tom had stopped cooperating with the investigators very early on because it was evident that the investigators had, quote, picked him as a target of this investigation from the very beginning. They pointed to the evidence that the prosecution had and asked the jury if they thought Tom would be stupid enough to buy a cooler from a store that was nearby his home and that was easily traceable. They said the cooler had not been bought with malicious intent. It was a gift for Jerry's new boat. But the real bombshell the defense dropped on the first day of opening statements was when they declared Annie, quote, died as a result of an outrageous, horrible, tragic accident that only one other person who was there knows everything that happened. Now, this was the first thing anyone had uttered about how Annie had died. They also admitted that, yes, Tom and Jerry did go out on Jerry's boat that day, and they did dispose of Annie's body, but they told the jury that they had to focus on the actual accident that killed Annie, not what happened to her body afterwards. Now, after court had been dismissed for the day, O'Terry told reporters that Annie had indeed died at Tom's home. Now, when asked why Tom would take her body on a boat if it was an accident, he shot back, quote, because you can't keep it at home. And he conveniently ignored questions from reporters that were like, well, wait a minute, if it was an accident, why didn't he call 911? And there were other questions that both the defense and the prosecution had to try to answer. For instance, how did Annie's floral dress, you know, the one that she had worn to dinner with Tom, gotten back to her apartment? Had she gone home after all and changed? Or had Tom brought it, the groceries, the leftovers, and the pantsuit over to Annie's apartment as a way to cover his tracks? There was no way to prove it one way or another. Another question was, where were Annie's missing keys? Someone had to have had them to enter Annie's apartment that night. And of course, in order to answer all these questions and put out like theories and stuff, I said this earlier, all of the emails, letters, like every exchange between Annie and Tom was read out loud in court with, as you can guess, the prosecution highlighting parts that added to their side and the defense doing the same. Now, when Kathleen, Annie's sister, testified, it is said all throughout her testimony, Tom just glared at her with like hatred, like venom in his look. And when she finally stepped down and had to walk by the defense table on her way out of the courtroom, I guess he hissed at her, quote, "You fucking bitch." And Kathleen said that the jury did hear him. Now, everyone you can think of involved with this case testified, right? Annie's siblings, Dr. Sullivan, Kay, and though the defense tried to block them, Annie's friends such as Kim, Jackie, Ginny, Siobhan, Jill, like anyone who was close to her also testified. Judge Lee allowed their testimonies because there was no other way to establish like Annie's state of mind. And as expected, Jerry, of course, testified, and I guess he actually almost got a mistrial declared when he accidentally, let slip in his testimony that he had taken a polygraph test. Case law in Delaware Superior Court provides that testimonies about polygraphs must not be referred to without a proper foundation, and Jerry had been informed of this before he testified, but yeah, he slipped. In the end, Judge Lee just instructed the jury to disregard that part of Jerry's testimony. Now, though the defense, of course, tried to highlight, what a douchebag Jerry was, he's a druggie, he's an alkie, look at, on and on and on. Apparently the fact that, he openly admitted all of this. He said that he was the leper of the family. He had been ostracized by his family at this point. When he said this stuff right here, that weighed a lot to the jury because they were like, dude, he has everything. Why would he do this to his brother who he clearly loves and admires if it wasn't true? You know what I mean? It was sort of like, why would he subject himself to this if this was all BS? It doesn't make sense. That was how the jury took Jerry as a witness. And though Lewis Jr. was, clearly shown to be, a cheat, a corrupt douchewad, adulterer, whatever, again, like with Jerry, he came off as very truthful to the jury. Because again, same thing with Jerry, why would he burn all of his life to the ground if this wasn't true? He loved Tom and he hated testifying against him, Now, it is said Tom himself was a pain-in-the-ass, childish prick in court. Surprise, surprise, right? I guess he kept acting like a part of the defense team rather than the defendant. He defied court rules and continuously tried to, talk and hang out with his family and friends. When he was in court, he treated the security guards around him with contempt. Openly with contempt, like they were beneath him. It's like, bro, you're on trial for murder. I guess he treated him with so much contempt that one time, during a recess, Tom had reached over to, I think hug his mom, and a guard had to tackle him, and Tom put up a fight, and he had to wrestle Tom into the hall. It was said even Tom's own lawyers, his own defense team, were growing really sick of him. He kept giving them notes and suggestions on what they should do as they were asking questions. As they were making statements, guys, he would write down a note and pass it down the line and give it to them, and so they would have to stop what they were doing and go look and see what Tom had told them to do. Isn't that wild? He was telling his attorneys what to do. Bear in mind, though Tom is a lawyer, he hadn't been in an actual courtroom, fighting an actual case, since his days as a defense attorney and a prosecutor. And apparently just all of his behavior was really grating on his own attorney's nerves. Yeah, and it was said Tom was just not loving how the trial was going. Not to mention, the whole Capano family was fractured at that point. The reputation was in the garbage. You had Lewis Jr. and Jerry being the pariahs of the family. Meanwhile, the Fahey siblings were, as far as optics go, as far as the media concerned, were just painted in the best light. They actually grew closer through the trial and through all this proceedings. It brought them closer together. And it was just funny because then you had the Capano family who this was splitting them apart. So yeah, you had those kind of optics going on in the press, and just Tom was not a fan of how his trial was going at all. Now, the real testimony people were anxious for, of course, was that of Debbie. Keith Brady had also been called to testify testify about his weird, bizarre night with Debbie and Tom. The prosecution knew that this fact was going to be brought up to court, and so they just thought, like, the best course of action was to just deal with it head on. Have Keith Brady testify to what happened that night, and then bring in Debbie. They also thought Keith's testimony would also add weight to the argument that they had that Tom had so much control and power over everyone in his life, even someone like Keith Brady. Now, when Debbie testified, I guess she let all of the tea spill. She testified about the affair. She read out the letters Tom had written for her, like, out loud in the courtroom. She talked about the phone calls with Tom on Thursday and Friday, and though Tom glared at her all throughout her testimony, Debbie was no longer under his spell. Like, she was done with him at this point. Quote, "I intended to keep on looking at him as I testified. I wanted him to realize what all his lies had done, and to know that I was no longer fooled by him." Yes, Debbie, yes. And Debbie looked Tom dead in the eye throughout her whole testimony. Like, she met his gaze and, like, yeah, it was just like, what now, bitch? I ain't afraid of you. Like, man, when I read that, I was like, oh, dude, I wish I could have been in the courtroom when that was going down. She recalled the phone conversation she had with Tom that Thursday evening, and she was able to remember rough times when she had these conversations because she was watching ER at the time. And she revealed one of the reasons that Tom was so irritated that night that they talked, and before he hung up on her, was that he said he needed her help with something the next morning, that Friday, but Debbie couldn't. She had work. And that's when Tom got, like, super agitated and irritated. And when she talked to Tom the next morning, Friday morning, she talked to him around 6:45 a.m. She had actually gotten up extra early to do her stuff that she needed to do to try and be available to Tom. But by the time she called him at 6:45, he said he no longer needed her help. Now, the theory is that when Debbie called that evening and left that voicemail, Tom had just killed Annie. Hence why he snapped and was irritable and told her, like, never to leave a voicemail on his answering machine. Now, police theorized that Tom was going to ask for Debbie's help in disposing of Annie's body. But by the next morning, when he talked to Debbie, he had already had Jerry's help, so yeah, he didn't need her anymore. Now, in response to Debbie's very damaging testimony, the defense, of course, tried to paint her as the, like, you know, the evil seductress who was a skank who slept with her friend's husband, and, you know, of course, that's how they're going to paint her. They even tried to say, get this, they even tried to say it was Debbie who had first initiated that encounter with Tom all the way back on New Year's Eve in 1981. Yeah, it was Debbie who initiated it. That's what they were trying to claim. And they even tried to say it was Debbie who had initiated the encounter with Keith Brady. It was all her idea. Like, you have Keith Brady's own testimony, though. How could you think that would work? And of course, because she had lied to investigators, they brought that up as a way to attack her, you know, try to show her as unreliable, not credible, you know. However, though Marr was the lawyer who was, like, asking Debbie questions, he was the one interrogating her while she was on the stand, Debbie got lucky. So Marr was actually considered one of the best defense attorneys in all of Delaware, and because Tom would not let Marr do his job, Debbie actually did pretty well under Marr's, like, interrogation of her. So Debbie said, quote, "There were long pauses between questions. While Marr read the notes that Tom kept handing him, it was obvious that Tom was in charge. And that helped me, because the pauses gave me time to gather my wits." But then, in a shocking twist, Marr then accused Debbie of being well aware of Anne Marie on June 27th and 28th. Not on July 2nd. He even then accused her of being the one to bring the gun over to Tom's house that night, and also accused Debbie of being the one who actually shot Annie that night. You can believe this, right? Yeah, of course Tom was throwing Debbie under the bus. Are you kidding me? In another, like, shocking twist, Susan Louth, who, remember, Tom thought was in his back pocket, also testified, but when she testified, she told the truth. Then, in early December, in the middle of his trial, Tom tried to fire all 4 of his attorneys so he could represent himself. In the end, he decided not to go through with it, but it is said, after this, the morale on the defense side, which was already kind of low, was especially so. It was just obvious to a lot of people that his lawyers really regretted getting involved in Tom's defense. Joey took the stand in Tom's defense, again trying to paint Jerry as having a bad memory, being unreliable, and reiterated that the cooler purchase was for Jerry and his new boat. There was nothing malicious about it. On December 16th, against his attorney's own advice, Tom took the stand in his own defense. Y'all, and oh my god, I can't even tell you, like, his whole thing that he said. Like, you really need to read the book. Like, I'm not even telling you everything that went down on this trial. It is wild, all right? It is wild. So Tom took the stand, like I said, on December 16th, and he would still be on the stand well after the new year. Yeah, his testimony took a while. So Tom was very eager to get at the jury himself. I mean, think about it. His whole life, Tom has been able to talk himself into anything, right? He's been able to talk people into doing things for him, and he thought, because he was just so smooth and charismatic, all he had to do was get his time with the jury where he could speak to them. He knew that he could get them to see his side and see reason. His testimony would end up filling 9 transcript books, and apparently in these transcript books, the font is so little that like 4 pages of like normal size font could fit on 1 page in these books, you know? And Tom's testimony would fill up 9 of these transcript books. So he reiterated what Joey had testified to, that the cooler was bought for Jerry. He went on and on about what a great person he was, reciting all of his great deeds and his accomplishments. I'm not kidding. Yeah, he really talked himself up. He said Debbie forced herself on him. Quote, I wasn't particularly interested in fooling around with somebody who, that if I did, could easily result in the loss of my job. Secondly, Debbie was by far not the most attractive female of the group. Yeah. Tom thought he was a really smooth operator with this, y'all. Can you believe that? He then set to work disparaging Annie. He said she was, quote, insistent on telling him every personal intimate detail of her life. Listed things such as the fact that she had dated someone of another race, had a nervous breakdown, and had anorexia as examples of things that spoke against her character. What? Dating someone of a different race? Having mental illness issues, like suffering from an eating disorder? That speaks against her character? Bro, it's definitely one of those things, right, where it's like, that actually says more about you than anything else. I swear, when narcissists testify, dude, it's amazing. He spent hours just saying awful things about Annie, always painting himself in the best light. He was the best friend. He gave her so many gifts. Whereas Annie was just a, quote, promiscuous girl with a lot of mental problems. By the way, Tom thought he was making a very good impression on the jury with this. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding. He thought he was nailing it. He confirmed that they had gone to Panorama Restaurant in Philadelphia that Thursday evening. But get this, he said while they were there, to discuss her anorexia, the waitress brought the wrong calamari to the table, and Annie was very upset about it. Quote, she had no patience for people who make mistakes like that. Tom said when they got to her apartment, they made plans to watch ER at his house. You know, since her apartment was so hot and all. So she ran upstairs to her apartment to drop off her food supply as well that Tom said he got her every week, and decided not to change her clothes. It was too hot. Besides, according to Tom, she kept some changes of clothes at his house. Now, once at his house, Tom said that Annie took off her pantyhose, and the two kicked back and watched ER. He said by the end of the episode, Annie had fallen asleep on his shoulder. And that is when Debbie called. Tom said he let it go to voicemail, checked it later, then called Debbie back from his study. She wanted to come over, but he told her no. They hung up. Then he went back to hang out with Annie on the couch. Quote, well, the next thing I knew, Debbie McIntyre was in the room. She must have entered the front door. She had a key to my house, and I had a key to her house. And she was pretty ballistic at the time. He said Debbie was yelling and ranting, demanding to know who Annie was. Tom said that Debbie had a lot of stresses from her job, so it wasn't unusual for her to rant and rave like this. Tom said he was trying to explain to both Debbie and Annie, who were both demanding to know who the other woman was, that this was all just a misunderstanding. He said Annie bent down to put on her pantyhose, intending to leave, as he was standing between the two women trying to calm Debbie down, who he said was berserk at this point, when, quote, Debbie shot Anne-Marie, and it was absolutely, positively, and certainly accidental. He said Debbie was talking as if she was going to shoot herself with the gun. Quote, and when I looked back to Debbie, the left arm was coming up, and I thought, oh my God, she's going to shoot herself. And so I reached out with my right hand to grab her left hand to pull the gun away from herself. And as I did that, a shot went off. I couldn't believe it. And she couldn't believe it either. He went on to elaborately explain how he tried to administer CPR to Annie, even getting Debbie involved, but it was no use. Annie was dead. Tom said he and Debbie were in shock. They didn't know what to do, and for the first time in his life, Tom said he panicked. He said he sent Debbie home, then, quote, I did something I'm capable of doing. I compartmentalized. Said that word on the first try. And then he set to work disposing of Annie's body. He said Annie was wearing what she had worn to the restaurant, leaving many confused on like, wait a minute, like if she was still wearing the flower dress from the restaurant, why was it at her apartment? He admitted to going to Annie's apartment, making the Star 69 call, turning on her AC, and bringing in the perishables into her apartment, even though in his own testimony he had earlier said Annie had brought up those perishables. I mean, you've already seen like so many holes in what Tom is saying here, right? He also denied going through her shoes and leaving the mess that Kathleen and Michael and the others found when they went to Annie's apartment. Now, regarding the tollback edits on his phone, Tom admitted that he had called his work voicemail in order to establish that he was home, and that he and Debbie had called each other back and forth and talked about what they should do about Annie. He said Debbie had come over and helped him move the cooler with Annie's body inside. Quote, it was something I could have never, ever have done by myself, and she helped me. He denied Jerry's story of an extortionist, and he said he only involved Jerry because Jerry had refused to give him the keys to his boat, and then pretty much reiterated Jerry's story of disposing Annie's body at sea. And he said after all of his loose ends were covered up, that's when he had gone to Debbie's in the middle of the night and gone to sleep. He explained those checks for $8,000 and $9,000, and the $8,000 he got from Jerry was for Annie and an eating disorder clinic that she wanted to go to. He said he borrowed the last $8,000 from Jerry because it seemed, quote, kind of showy to go back to the bank for a third time. This dude really thinks he's nailing it with his testimony, guys. He said it was Nick's idea to burglarize Debbie's home, and that the inmate had, quote, pressured him into it. Tom said Nick took advantage of his mental state at that point. He was crushed that Debbie would, quote, lie and turn state's witness against him. And when Connolly finally got his turn to cross-examine Tom, oh my lord. Oh my lord. He played Tom like a fiddle, guys. So it said Connolly was very good at his job, alright? He was a very good lawyer. And Tom was not nearly as intelligent or as good of a lawyer as he thought he was, and Connolly was actually a good lawyer. Connolly poked so many holes in Tom's testimony, forcing Tom to go over in intricate detail what he had said in his testimony. But I guess what really triggered Tom was when Connolly brought up Tom's daughters. Tom really thought he was the perfect family man and like the perfect father, and Connolly, who we know Tom loathes, got Tom so worked up, so enraged, that Tom, from the witness stand, suddenly stood up, smacked the microphone off the stand, and started raging at Connolly, like yelling and screaming at him. He accused the prosecution of not just involving his daughters, but doing something to his mother, too. In actuality, she was merely served, I think, some sort of subpoena or something. He was so rageful and was such a petulant child, he was physically escorted out of the courtroom. Everyone was just stunned at this demonstration of like anger and hostility. Robert Jr., remember Annie's brother, later said, quote, that was probably what my sister saw just before she died. The last face Annie saw. And on January 17th, 1999, the jury convicted Tom of the first-degree murder of Anne Marie Fahey. Apparently, this was the first time in Delaware state history in which a person was convicted of murder without a body or a murder weapon. Isn't that incredible? I guess it was also one of the first trials in the country where, like, email played a very significant role as far as evidence is concerned, and, like, that was a pretty big deal. Now, at Tom's penalty hearing, his family, even Kay, pleaded for his life because Tom was eligible for the death penalty. Linda was also allowed to testify, and it was here at his penalty hearing that Linda would tell of her experiences with Tom. Tom spoke at his penalty hearing as well, rambling on for like 45 minutes. I guess he included like quotes from the Beatles and a bunch of like just weird stuff. And just, I guess he just, spoke about how awesome he was and how betrayed he had been by everyone he had helped and yada, yada, yada. Kind of what we come to expect from Tom at this point. And on January 28th, by a 10-2 vote, the jury recommended the death penalty for Tom. And it was then up to Judge Lee to either fulfill the jury's recommendation or sentence Tom to life. And Tom was ultimately sentenced to death via lethal injection. But then, in January 2006, the Delaware Supreme Court affirmed Tom's conviction, but remanded the case for resentencing because they said the death penalty could not be enacted if the jury wasn't unanimous in its decision, which in this case it was not. It was a 10-2 vote. The next month, in February, the state just abandoned their pursuit of the death penalty and instead opted to just throw Tom behind bars for life. In April of 2008, the U.S. District Court rejected Tom's habeas corpus petition, and on September 2nd of that same year, the U.S. Third Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed this decision. Tom then opted not to attempt to appeal his case to the Supreme Court, bringing his appeals to an end. In March of 2000, Tom attempted to sue Debbie, claiming she was the cause of Annie's death. The Fahey family was suing the Capano family. They had actually filed suit against the Capanos in June of 1998, and Tom was arguing in this lawsuit against Debbie that should the Fahey family win any sort of like monetary damages from that lawsuit they had against the Capanos, that Debbie should have to pay it. The suit against Debbie was eventually dropped in November of that same year, and the Faheys and the Capanos, except for Tom, reached a settlement via a mediator in January of 2001. Tom refused to participate or have anything to do with it because he still protested his innocence. And then finally, on September 19th, 2011, at 12:34 p.m., 61-year-old Tom Capano was found dead in his cell at James T. Vaughn Correctional Center. He had been found by an officer performing like a routine check. His cause of death was listed as sudden cardiac arrest, so he had heart problems, coupled with obesity, and these contributed to his death. Apparently, he had gained upwards of 100 plus pounds since 2006 when his life sentence was handed down, and I guess he had just remained obese that whole time. Now, following Tom's death, Lewis, Jerry, and Joey all engaged in a bitter legal dispute, and it was, of course, over money. It was over the family money. Specifically, it was over Capano Investments, which owned and operated many of the Capano businesses and stuff like that. In 2013, Joey accused Lewis Jr. of squeezing him out of Capano Investments, and then weeks later, Jerry filed his own suit against Lewis Jr., saying that his brother had defrauded him at a very vulnerable point in his life, which was, of course, after the trial. And Jerry said Lewis Jr. had used this fact, like this time after the trial and Jerry's like mental state and stuff, to push him out of Capano Investments. But while the suit was still ongoing, on August 10th, 2015, Joey Capano died of a heart attack at the age of 62. And I tried finding updates to this lawsuit, but I couldn't really find anything. So yeah, please let me know if you know like what was the result of this lawsuit, like what happened. Yeah, drop a link down below because I would love to know. And then to wrap up, in the summer of 1998, 2 years after her disappearance, Anne Marie Fahey was officially pronounced dead. Her body has never been recovered and never been found. And Mark Fahey, one of Annie's brothers, ended up dying in 2004, as did Linda Marandola. Marguerite ended up dying in 2013, and Annie's oldest brother, Kevin Fahey, ended up dying in 2017. And oh my god, you guys, that was the Tom Capano case. Can you believe it? Can you believe everything that I told you? And like I said, man, I probably could have turned like this into a 4-parter because I didn't even tell you everything that went down at the trial. Like, oh my god. It is incredible. I highly recommend Anne Rule's book, And Never Let Her Go. There's so much to just go over, and I had to set the line somewhere, right? But yeah, I highly recommend. This case was wild. When I read that this case was tried without a body or a murder weapon, I was like, oh my god, like, is this gonna be one of those cases where it's like, oh, did he or didn't he? But no, I'm sorry. Like, it's so obvious that Tom killed her. So obvious. And honestly, Jerry and Lewis Jr.'s testimonies alone have so much weight. They lost so much. They destroyed their family. You're just not going to do that if it wasn't true, you know? And I'm curious to know, what do you guys think? So do you think the night that Tom killed Annie, what are we thinking? Do we think it was malicious? Do we think it was an accident? Like, what do you think? Do you think maybe he brought her over there, maybe was going to give her an ultimatum, and then when it was clear she was telling him to pound sand, that's when he shot her? Maybe they got into an argument and he accidentally shot her? What do you guys think? I don't know. Because we did such a deep dive into Tom and really read about him, you could totally buy that he would plan something like this out, buying the cooler, the gun, laying out all these like stories and stuff to people around him about extortionists and getting money from Jerry. Like, dude, he called his work voicemail to try to establish like his presence in his own home at that time. I mean, I could totally believe that he had planned this and he had decided in his mind, like, all right, I'm gonna give her one more chance. And if she doesn't come back to me, that's it. Like, I'm done with her. She's gonna be dead. I could totally buy that. Please tell me, guys, like, what do you think? What do you think? And I guess I didn't even get into, like, what the jury thought of everything. Like, apparently for the jury, not only was it Lewis Jr. and Jerry's testimony that really held a lot of weight for them, Tom's outburst, obviously. I guess when Tom was saying that Annie had bent down to put on her pantyhose, that was really a red flag to a lot of the females on the jury, because they're like, wait a minute. Pantyhose are a pain in the ass to put on and get off. If she wanted to get out of that situation, she could have easily just left without putting her pantyhose on. So that just kind of seemed wrong to them. And then I guess in the cooler, they were trying to decide, like, if her body could have even fit in that cooler, and they had a very petite, small juror who got in the cooler, and she could barely fit, and it was theorized and decided that Tom had probably broken Annie's feet and or legs in order to, like, shove her body in that cooler. Yeah, and there's so much that the jury, like, certain jurors had come out and said stuff, and, like, man, I had to stop it somewhere. But yeah, man, like I said, I highly recommend Anne Rule's book. Thank you so much to Tyler Manter. You have recommended me some really good cases. I think this one is definitely my favorite that you've recommended so far. This was such an amazing case, and narcissists like Tom, man, what do you do? What do you do? And then on top of that he was like a silver spoon little rich bitch on top of that. Oh my lord. Oh my lord. Like, are we really surprised that he turned out like this? Like a spoiled, selfish, rotten, old piece of shit. That's exactly what he is. Like, Tom sucks. The world is a better place for him being dead. Yeah, he hurt a lot of people, not just, you know, the Fahey's and Annie's other family and friends. He hurt his own, dude. I don't know. Please tell me your thoughts on this case. Thank you so much for hanging out with me these last few weeks. Christmas is this Sunday. If you celebrate, I hope you have a wonderful, wonderful time. I hope whatever you celebrated this holiday season, I really hope it was fantastic for you. I truly, truly mean that. Shit sucks, and yeah, we all deserve to have, like, some happy times once in a while, right? Alrighty, y'all. I will let you go. We will be back next week for our last case of 2022. Can you believe it? And then I'm gonna go ahead and take the first Tuesday of January off. I know, sorry, but I'm also a freelance casting assistant, and I got some work thrown my way, so I gotta focus on that. On top of trying to add stuff to the channel. I'm gonna try really, really hard. And with that, that'll do it for this week for Crime Dive. I hope you, again, have a wonderful, wonderful Christmas, and I will see you here next week. Bye-bye.